It looked as if the body had been dropped from the sky.
I could hear my mum screaming, and by then I just knew.
It just wasn't right, so it fills you with a cold dread.
So here we are coming to the stage where the serial killer effect kicked in.
Early in the morning of the 28th of August 1981, a commuter discovered the mutilated body of a young girl dumped by the Thames in Windsor. Unable to pinpoint exactly where she'd been killed meant that finding the killer was like looking for a needle in a haystack. All the police knew for certain was that they were looking for a violent and sadistic individual who took pleasure in inflicting pain, and that he was likely to do it again. Built on the banks of the River Thames in Berkshire is the town of Windsor. It's home to Windsor Castle, which has been an official residence of the British royal family for almost 1,000 years.
Windsor is a very, very busy town, very busy tourist town. However, the village of Windsor, the residence area of Windsor, is very local, just like any other village, and everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody else's business.
On a bright, sunny Friday morning in August 1981, Kenneth Linney of Thames Valley Police received a phone call, starting a case that would become a 30-year personal crusade.
I was at home and I received a call about 6:30 in the morning to say that a body had been found on the banks of the Thames in Windsor. I immediately attended.
When Detective Superintendent Linney reached the scene at 6:45, he was met by a horrific sight.
I arrived at Barry Avenue, where the body was in a face-down position, naked, that of a teenage girl, and it transpired that it was found by a man on his way to work. He immediately notified the police. I then made various phone calls and got other officers out to form an inquiry team and the uniformed officers to seal the area off. And from there it went on into a general investigation.
There was no attempt to conceal the body, in fact, far from it. And one can only speculate as to the significance of this, but it could be that leaving the body in that condition to full public view might have been an additional twist to the humiliation of the victim.
Houseboats moored just meters from the body were immediately investigated.
All those boats were stopped from moving, and officers then started interviewing the occupants to see if they'd heard anything during the night.
By 7 a.m. they had ascertained that no one had heard anything, and Detective Superintendent Linney continued organising the investigation.
I notified then the Home Office pathologist. I then formulated a small incident room at Windsor Police Station until we had identified the body. It was very important to find out who this girl was. No girl had been reported missing in the Windsor area.
Almost 13 miles away near Hanwell in West London, mother of 3 Carol Walterton made a worrying discovery about her 17-year-old daughter Claire.
Went to wake her up and she wasn't in her bed, and it just wasn't right, so it fills you with a cold dread.
A worried Carol went to work, whilst in Windsor the police investigation continued.
It looked as if the body had been dropped from the sky due to the fact there was no blood or anything outside the basic body area. And bear in mind that there were severe wounds to the body. This was a problem for us. But we could find no forensic evidence as to where it was dropped from.
The forensic team then went about doing a procedure called taping.
Taping is done with sellotape to take any particles off the body. It's laid out then and sealed and used later on then for forensic report purposes.
In the early 80s, forensic scientists could only compare and match fibre samples. So until they found a comparison, the tapings were sent for storage. Then a preliminary investigation was carried out by the pathologist at the scene.
The wounds that were on the body could have been done in situ, where the body was found. But the body was definitely unconscious, if not lifeless, when it was laid on the footpath.
The pathologist found that Claire's throat had been cut and she'd been sadistically mutilated. It was too much, even for the most experienced of officers.
The injuries caused to the girl, horrific injuries that were caused to her, and how she must have suffered. And I think it affects you. I had four daughters, and I could see my teenage daughters in the same situation. So it does affect you.
It wasn't long before this horrendous and baffling murder made the national news.
I went to work and heard on the radio that they'd found somebody, her body, and I just knew it was her. I just knew it was her from where they found her in Windsor, which wasn't far from us. I don't know why, I just knew it was her, so I went into a complete panic. I phoned all the friends that I knew to see whether she was there. I phoned her work, and they were very cross that she just hadn't turned up. So I got home and went straight to the police station.
Once Claire had been reported missing, police quickly made the potential link.
The Metropolitan Police rang to say that a girl was missing from the Hanwell area. So we've notified them again, and officers came down and they identified the body.
Certain they had the right person, it was time for the police to tell the family and confirm Carol's worst fears.
Yes, it was her. After they looked at photos and things. And I can't even begin to describe what it was like after that.
Claire's older brother Nick arrived home, hoping his sister was still just missing.
After I heard it on the radio and everything else, and I made my way home, and that, as I was walking down the pavement, I could hear my mum screaming indoors. I could hear her screaming, and by then I just knew as well. And I think it was the police or someone that answered the door, and I think I just turned and said, "Is it?" or something, and they said, "Yeah."
Thames Valley police officers wasted no time looking into Claire's background.
I went up with another officer to Yedding Lane, to the family home, and there spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. They, of course, were in a terrible state, and I then again got officers to sit with them and left them to mourn their fate. It was a terrible shock, because the girl was used to going out during the day, and she was a local girl, and was well liked by everybody in the district.
On a council estate, there wasn't too much to do, but you have lots of friends, so she was always with friends, and, well, we always had a house full of friends. I think that was more her enjoyment. And also when she got her job, that became the be-all and end-all of her life, because she loved it so much and obviously loved the people there as well.
The next morning, the sun may have risen as usual, but for Claire's mum, Carol, the world as she knew it had ended.
All I can really remember is the house being full of policemen. It was just basically showing photos, and so really then we were dealing with it the next day when we knew it really was her, and been dealing with it ever since.
Whilst the family began a lifetime of grieving, the police continued with their investigation, determined to find Claire's vicious killer.
It was decided that an incident room, a major incident room, should be set up in the Metropolitan Police District.
Pete Byrne was a young policeman at that time.
I was involved in the investigation in that I was a young detective and was part of the 50-strong team of detectives that worked on the investigation.
The police's first job was to build up a picture of Claire and her final movements on that fateful Thursday night.
Claire was ironing and we said, "Are you going out tonight?" And she said, "No."
Me and Claire was just sitting in the kitchen having a chat, which was unusual really. We was having a good old chat and everything, and she weren't going out that night. And that, you know. But the funny thing was, I remember, God, we must be growing up because of the way we was talking to each other. But I don't know, she was staying in and that was it.
But when we got home, she had gone out. She was 17, it wasn't a problem. But she was always in by 10 o'clock or abouts. But I thought 17, okay, it's 11 o'clock, you know. It's always the first time. But then when she didn't come home, couldn't sleep at all because it just wasn't like her. She'd never been away all night unless we'd known about it. But then I heard laughing outside and I thought, oh, she's home. So I went off to sleep.
It didn't take long for police to piece together Claire's last night.
On the Thursday evening, Claire had gone to see her boyfriend who ran an amusement arcade on the Uxbridge Road at Ealing. She had left there around about 10 p.m. Normally, he would have given her a lift home, but they had a slight disagreement and she refused a lift. So she walked along the Uxbridge Road in the direction of her home in Northolt. Her boyfriend did attempt to get her into the car, stopped, asked her to get into the car, but she refused. That sighting of Claire being spoken to by her boyfriend is the last known sighting of Claire alive.
The boyfriend was immediately treated as a suspect.
He said he went home then by 10:30 that night, but he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Even though the police had been left with no clues, could they have already managed to find the murderer? In August 1981, 17-year-old Claire Walterton had been horrifically murdered and dumped in Windsor, and so far, no forensic evidence had been found. Police had quickly pieced together Claire's final movements, identifying the last person she was seen with, who was arrested for murder and questioned.
Inquiries in relation to his whereabouts later on that evening revealed that he had gone home and was seen by a neighbour walking a dog shortly afterwards, so therefore he was ruled out as being the potential attacker of Claire.
With their only suspect now eliminated, the police looked at using the power of publicity.
There was a lot of media activity, television and all, up at Hanwell. And of course the papers then had the large columns on it.
Information about Claire's last night was released by police to the press.
Two ladies came forward following publicity and said that they'd seen a girl dragged into a car at the junction of Uxbridge and Yedding Lane about roughly around the time that Claire was last seen. They couldn't give any descriptions. All they could say was a dark-coloured car.
Keen to get the most from their only lead, police weren't afraid to try experimental techniques.
I resorted to hypnotists actually interviewing some of these people because we felt that if you can probably refresh someone's memory by that means, then, of course, we may come up with something that the person doesn't think of normally.
Hypnotism didn't seem to have the desired effect.
Whether that person that the lady saw was Claire is unknown. A large part of the initial investigation centred on trying to identify that vehicle, but it was never traced.
The ladies were so vague about this. They thought a girl was pulled into a car. There was no screams, nothing whatsoever. And it was some distance away, they saw it. So there was no evidential value, really, in that particular incident.
Disappointed but undeterred, the investigation team continued with their inquiries.
The incident room then, once we established it at Norwood Green, became a very busy place because we had to do a lot of house-to-house inquiries from Hanwell down the Uxbridge Road right up to the top of Yedding Lane, which would have covered at the area where she would have walked. Then other inquiries had to be dealt with. You had inquiries, national inquiries, you had inquiries dealing with people with previous convictions for that type of offence or for sexual offences. So there was a lot of work to be done and a lot of foot slogging, to put it plainly.
For some on the team, this was all a new experience.
It was my first ever murder, and I was just learning how things are done on a major investigation in terms of the system. There was no computer as such, so everything was paper-based, but everything had to be done in a clear and methodical way so that nothing was missed.
There was a huge amount of work to be done.
The police inquiries, the witnesses, the incident room sometimes picks out something which is unusual from statements or movements or a person, the background of a person. And they have to be followed up, and they're known as actions. Actions are then dealt with by the detective officers who are out on the ground. It takes a long time. The average working hours during the day in an inquiry like that can be anything from 12 to 14 hours a day. Takes a lot of work.
After months of fruitlessly investigating every possible avenue, police were getting desperate.
Clairvoyants came forward. So many people came forward because it was a nasty murder. And the press gave it a lot of publicity.
With nothing to lose, a clairvoyant was introduced to Carol and the family.
She got in touch with them and they were clutching at straws. And she stayed for a couple of hours. But she kept saying things that Claire would have said, but Claire would never have spoken the way she was speaking, and she kept making out she was talking to her, which I found so upsetting, because if Claire was going to talk to anybody, she would have talked to me. Sorry. So, yeah, I had to ask her if she would go in the end, because she'd really overstayed her welcome.
In the spring of 1982, over 6 months after Claire Walterton's mutilated body was discovered in Windsor, the police still didn't have a single lead.
We tried everything, and with the result, of course, we didn't get anywhere. We had all our exhibits. They were put in storage in 1982. And then, as I say, I thought at that stage that we'll never solve the case unless, because of the sadistic injuries that were caused, were we dealing with a serial killer.
It was a horrible thought. Claire's killer probably wouldn't be caught unless they killed again.
This was someone who was really, really sadistic. And that was the type of person we were looking for.
The mutilation, the clearly sexual nature of the crime, suggests that there's a distinct possibility that the individual would strike again.
The failure to track down Claire's murderer was a big blow for everyone concerned.
You have to remember what things were like back in 1981. DNA as an investigative tool didn't exist. There was no CCTV. Mobile phones were very, very rare, and automatic number plate recognition didn't exist. However, you can only do what you can do, and if all the normal lines of inquiry haven't produced anything, then unfortunately you have to be pragmatic, and the investigation is wound down.
Well, it's disappointing that you like to get a result. You think of the girl lying on the pavement in Windsor, and it affects you. I don't care how hard anybody is, but it affects you. And it affected other officers at the time.
The chilling thought that Claire's killer would strike again never left the officers involved in the case. And in December 1984, Detective Superintendent Linney received the news he'd been expecting for over 2 years.
I had a phone call from officers over at Denham to say that they had found a body on the golf course. They told me that the body that they had was of a girl, naked and with horrific injuries. Now, I thought, well, this is identical. The modus operandi kicked in. The modus operandi is the method used by criminals, the same method that is used. And that is the base of serial killers. So here we are coming to the stage where the serial killer effect kicked in.
Now investigating 2 similar killings, Thames Valley Police were forced to wonder, had Claire's murderer struck again? Just over 3 years after the unsolved murder of Claire Walterton in Windsor, a mutilated body of a woman called Deirdre Sainsbury was found dumped at a golf course in Denham. It was a discovery that grabbed the police's attention. The body found on the golf course had chilling similarities to the murder of Claire Walterton.
As soon as I heard of this incident and the fact that it was identical more or less to the girl that was found in Windsor, Claire Walterton's name, of course, was there, printed all over it.
A murder investigation was immediately launched.
The police publicised the fact of the murder, and by chance, a man had seen Deirdre get into a vehicle on the South Circular Road in Richmond. That man had only recently read an article in the Reader's Digest which talked about the dangers of hitchhikers, and he had the presence of mind to record the index number or registration number of the car that this hitchhiker had got into.
It was a huge piece of luck.
Police from the Denham inquiry, having received the registered owner of the vehicle, went to the house of Colin Campbell, who was the registered owner. They searched his property and found in the garage the clothing from the girl found on the golf course at Denham.
Police arrested and interviewed 37-year-old travelling salesman and keen amateur hockey player, Colin Campbell.
He admitted picking Deirdre up, stated that he chatted to her en route. In doing so, he gave his name, or his first name, and he felt, as he was getting on so well with her, he would try it on. He did. According to him, she retaliated and hit him, and then he hit her. But he stated he hit her so hard that she became unconscious. He stated he then panicked because he'd given his name to her, and in a panic, he then hit her about the head with a hockey stick, which is in the back of his car.
Campbell also admitted mutilating the body, allegedly to make it look like a maniac had done it. Convinced that there was a strong connection between Deirdre and Claire's killings, Detective Superintendent Linney went to see Campbell, hoping he might also confess to Claire's murder.
He was absolutely so suave, so complete, answered everything that I asked. Windsor? Oh yes, he'd been to Windsor. He'd been everywhere that I mentioned. But I had nothing whatsoever at that stage to connect him with Claire's murder. Nothing had been found at his property. And so I was left as I was in the beginning. And which was rather sad actually, because I thought that he might just break, but no.
It was disappointing, but the investigation into the brutal murder of Deirdre Sainsbury moved quickly.
Having been interviewed, admitted being responsible for Deirdre's death, he was charged with the murder and stood trial at Reading Crown Court. His plea in court was not guilty to murder. He stated that whilst responsible for Deirdre's death, he killed her whilst suffering an epileptic episode.
The jury chose not to believe an epileptic episode could explain this brutal and sexually motivated killing. In July 1985, just 6 months after her death, Campbell was convicted of Deirdre Sainsbury's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. But Detective Superintendent Linney wasn't satisfied.
It was too much of a coincidence that we had the modus operandi of a man who was sadistic when he dealt with Deirdre Sainsbury, and the same man, in my opinion, committed the murder of Claire Wolterton. I had to sit back and just wait and wait, because I felt this. He might talk later on. This happens. They sometimes do, if there's something on their mind.
Unaware of Kenneth Linney's theory, as the years went by, Claire's family tried to cope with the huge void that had been left in their lives.
I think about it all the time. Always remember birthdays. Christmases is very difficult because she was Christmas. Holidays were difficult. In fact, you spend a lot of time thinking that you shouldn't be doing holidays, Christmas and things like that, because it didn't feel right without her being there.
For me, Claire was Claire. I can't explain to you how that is. Claire was just a happy-go-lucky Claire.
Most memories I have are quite normal memories, because having a meal was just never having a meal. It was always laughing, having a meal at something that she'd either done or was doing while you were having the meal. So mostly when we sit down for dinner, I often remember some of the silly things she did. You know, she would either have peas up her nose or ice cream all over her face, or she would fill her mouth up with food and then laugh with her mouth open. It sounds awful, but when you're having a meal, it's actually quite funny.
Well, with my brother, it really affected him badly. He had a nervous breakdown and everything. So in the end, I didn't just lose a sister, I lost half of a brother as well, because he just weren't the same ever since.
In 1996, 15 years after his conviction for murdering Deirdre Sainsbury, Colin Campbell appealed.
He stated that whilst he was guilty of causing her death, it wasn't murder.
At the appeal, he put forward the same defence as his original trial, but this time with the backing of an expert, who stated that due to being on the wrong medication, an epileptic episode could have been to blame. Campbell's conviction was quashed, and in 1999, a retrial ordered.
At that retrial, Campbell proffered a plea to manslaughter, which was accepted by the Crown, and he was therefore convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment again, but with a minimum tariff of 1 day.
The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Gage, said that whilst the court accepted that at the time of the killing Campbell's responsibility had been diminished, he still constituted a danger to the public, so couldn't be released without going through a parole hearing. It wasn't the result he'd hoped for.
And at subsequent hearings before the parole board, it was deemed that he was too dangerous to be released.
As the years went by, Campbell remained in prison, but the unsolved murder of Claire Wolterton was never forgotten.
We didn't close the case completely, of course. You never do. We carried on taking inquiries and questions and answers from people, for other forces ringing up. This often happens, and you compare notes.
Police remained determined that they would bring Claire's murderer to justice. By 2011, the depraved murderer of Claire Walterton still hadn't been found, although police did have their suspicions about Colin Campbell, who was imprisoned for the strikingly similar 1984 killing of Deirdre Sainsbury. In 2007, Thames Valley Police had started looking at cold cases headed up by Pete Byrne. Claire's case was about to turn a corner.
In 2011, we had the capacity to commence a reinvestigation and a review into Claire's case. What we were looking to do was to use advancements in forensic science in the intervening 30 years to see if we could potentially identify the person responsible for her death.
What the review team found was to be key in moving the case forward.
One of the items that we submitted for additional forensic work was the tapings. These tapings had been originally taken to potentially obtain fibres. However, we knew from other cases that had been investigated by other forces within the UK that now you could get DNA that had been captured from those tapings.
The evidence was sent to LGC Forensics near Oxford for DNA analysis.
Tapes were examined microscopically and small sections were cut out and submitted for DNA profiling.
Pete Byrne contacted Kenneth Linney, who had retired, to tell him a cold case review was taking place.
Which I was delighted about, because I thought something might happen or come from that.
It didn't take long for the lab to come back with a result.
A mixed DNA profile was obtained which appeared to be from Claire Walterton and from an unknown male. We used that profile of the unknown male to search the National DNA Database, and this identified a list of potential contributors. Colin Campbell was amongst those individuals.
It was a name that was well known to everyone involved in the original 1981 case.
The moment I saw his name, I knew that he was a convicted killer. So I was obviously really, really excited.
The match to Campbell was strong, but it wasn't strong enough to guarantee a conviction.
At that point, they were able to say it was a 1 in a million match probability. Whilst that's good, normally for DNA, it's a 1 in a billion match probability.
A 1 in a million match probability meant that there could be up to 60 other individuals in the country who the DNA could belong to. 1 in a billion would mean it almost certainly came from Campbell.
So we needed additional forensic work to take place, which involved using a professor of genetic statistics from UCL College in London. That was going to take time, and also we were doing additional tests on other tapings that had been recovered from Claire's body.
In 2011, having been in prison for 26 years, Campbell was coming to the end of his sentence for what was now the manslaughter of Deirdre Sainsbury.
Campbell was a Category D prisoner, which meant he was allowed access out into the open, and obviously it was a potential danger to members of the public, the fact that this man potentially now was a double killer. So we had to make contact with the prison service, get him recategorised so that he was sent back to a closed prison.
Finally, after months of waiting, there was news from UCL College in London.
We had work completed by this professor of genetics who was able to say that the match probability, in his opinion, was 1 in a billion of Colin Campbell being the donor of the DNA found on the tapings.
The news meant that Kenneth Linney's original hunch in 1984 about Campbell had been right.
When I found out that Colin Campbell had been identified through DNA as being identical to a person's hair, his hair, which had been found on the tape taken at our mortuary, I was delighted.
On November the 27th, 2012, 31 years after Claire was killed, Colin Campbell was arrested. Police decided to question him.
Campbell showed no remorse whatsoever, and I got the impression that he felt that he was a victim, in as much that he had epilepsy, it had been wrongly diagnosed, he'd been given the wrong medication years ago, and it's other people's fault.
My lifestyle meant that the way I was, I wasn't averse to being friendly with the lady.
Yeah.
I may well have known a series of ladies.
Okay.
Claire may have been one of them. No, I don't. She looks like any girl I may have played hockey with. She looks like any girl I may have met through work.
Okay.
Actually, she looks like a happy person, and I'm glad about that. No, I don't recognise her.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's not to say I never ever knew her. I just don't remember her.
To my mind, had you committed that horrendous act against Claire, you would have known what you'd done and you'd remember it. But he was almost blasé about the fact, well, I can't remember what I was doing. We consulted with the Crown Prosecution Service. They agreed that Campbell should be charged. He was charged.
Once Campbell was charged, it was time to inform Claire's family.
Somebody described it as like a fresh scab that had been picked off. It was like an old wound that had been reopened, and that described it quite well for me.
On the 15th of November 2013, Colin Frederick Campbell stood trial at Reading Crown Court for the 1981 murder of Claire Walterton. Claire's mum, Carol, was there from the start.
It was very, very, very hard and very emotional and very upsetting.
Colin Campbell entered a plea of not guilty.
Campbell couldn't run the defence that the epilepsy was the cause of his actions which resulted in Claire's death. That was because the experts had given evidence for him in relation to Deirdre's death weren't happy to say that epilepsy could be responsible for two homicides.
Claire's mum, Carol, had her own way of dealing with the grisly details of the case.
I didn't stay in for all the nasty bits at all. But what I was in there for was quite difficult.
Claire's family had tremendous courage. Claire's mum wanted to come to court. She wanted to make sure that the man responsible for her daughter's death was convicted. But at the same time, and rightly so, she didn't want to know the full details of what happened to her daughter.
The prosecution called on their trump card, the DNA.
The key item was the DNA evidence. That's what brought the case to court in the first place. And when a DNA expert tells a jury this DNA is 1 billion times more likely to belong to Colin Campbell than anyone else, I think that was the key bit of information.
Faced with such compelling DNA evidence, Campbell put up his own defence.
He couldn't recall ever going into the amusement arcade where Claire had been that evening, but said he may have got in there, and had he gone in there, he may well have spoken to her, and he may well have touched her, and that's how his DNA got on her body. What was interesting was that the taping that from where the DNA was obtained was marked as being taken from Claire's buttocks, so therefore the fact that he was potentially saying it was innocent contact made that extremely unlikely.
The defence were, if I recall, trying to sort of blur the lines a little bit and discredit the DNA. But I think when you say it's 1 billion times, that's pretty damning.
At the beginning of December 2013, the judge sent the jury out to deliberate.
The jury took quite a long time for it to come out, to make up their mind, which was just a nightmare again. You don't realise how much that is chewing you up inside and how much tense you are. And that.
After 3 excruciating days, the jury came back, and Campbell was convicted of murder. A few days later, the sentence followed. The judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, stated that only Campbell would know the true circumstances in which he came to pick up Claire Walterton that Thursday night in 1981, but that he was certain he did it with the intention of sexually assaulting, mutilating, and ultimately killing her.
Colin Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Claire Walterton. He must serve a minimum of 24 years. By that time, he'll be 90 years of age.
For Claire's family, it was a bittersweet moment.
I started to get fed up with people going, oh, now you'll have closure. Because you don't have closure. She's still gone. She still went through something that was horrible. I mean, I really do say I am really pleased that they got him, but having it all raked up again was really difficult.
What he got and everything else weren't even long enough, as far as I'm concerned.
He took a beautiful life away. A beautiful life. Somebody who was just coming into being a girl, a woman. And that's just not fair. It's not fair.
Kenneth Linney, who had been involved from the very beginning, was there to hear it all.
The judge, of course, made it quite clear to him when he sentenced him that he wasn't going to get away with the epilepsy excuse that he gave before. They couldn't produce any witnesses to say that it was epilepsy. And the judge made a comment that if the Court of Appeal had known his background, he mightn't have had his sentence squashed. And it was nice to know that he was convicted and rightly sentenced to a long term. He will never be released from prison.
Although former Detective Superintendent Linney wasn't the only officer with a vested interest in the outcome.
Since 1981, Claire's case has been at the forefront of everyone's mind that worked on that case. When I got my current job, when I met old detectives that worked on Claire's case, they always asked me, what's happening with Claire's case? They were all extremely pleased when we got the result and Campbell was convicted. So much so that they held a reunion 6 months after the trial where they just wanted to meet up, talk about the case and just say well done, because it was all part of their life.
After 32 years of trying to solve this brutal and bewildering case, Kenneth Linney could be satisfied they'd got the right man.
Many more people would he have killed had he got away with the Denham case. Because if you get someone who starts that activity of killing young girls and causing horrific injuries on them, when do they stop? That's the question. And I believe that we did stop the makings of a serial killer.
Campbell was in his late 60s at the time of his conviction for Claire's brutal murder, which means it was unlikely he'd ever be released. Finally, Claire and Deirdre's families could feel that justice had been done.
The scenery is stunning, but the lies are getting uglier. Reese Witherspoon, Nicole Kidman and Laura Dern lead an all-star cast. Big Little Lies is new Friday at 9 on Sky Mix.
When police arrived at the scene, they found a body of a woman that had been badly beaten.
She had numerous injuries, more than 20 in total, mainly to her head.
She was covered in blood. It was a shocking sight.
She'd been battered to death. It looked like there'd maybe been a burglary.
The house had been ransacked. The
fact that this has happened in broad daylight, at a time when people are taking their children to school, it strikes fear throughout everybody.
A lot of people are scared living around here.
You just can't believe that it's happened.
The big fear is that our community is then under threat.
In the heart of the East Midlands lies historic Lincoln.
It's just got a wonderful, timeless feeling to it, Lincoln. We are a place of great historical interest. We've got everything, castles, cathedrals. There's a great many medieval churches, and there's a great waterway in the centre as well, the Brayford, established by the Romans. So we are a good tourist destination. And people like the fact we're not overly commercialised. We just think it's a wonderful, vibrant place.
And in recent years, Lincoln has become increasingly popular with overseas students.
The university, which is a huge university and pretty much world famous, they've got colleges as well. There are a lot of students, and a lot of the students are foreign nationals, many from the East Asian area. There is a nice mix.
To the south of Lincoln, on the River Witham, lies the suburb of Sincil Bank.
Sincil Bank area of Lincoln is a very tight-knit community, being adopted by the students and working-class Lincoln folk. A stone's throw away from the football ground. It does have a very villagey feel. You will see children playing football in the street.
The Sincil Bank community is very diverse. I've been a resident my whole life, and we have a lot of people that are from different ethnic backgrounds. And because we're so close to the university and stuff, we do get a lot of uni students come to live down here, especially now that the university's getting more popular. We also have a lot of elderly people, but we always try and find a way to build that community together. It's more like a village. People are always supportive of each other.
It's just a nice, friendly place. Everybody knows everybody on the street and everybody chats with everybody. All the kids play out together. It's got a proper community vibe.
It's very close to the South Common, which is the major green area in the south of Lincoln.
You know, there's a lovely park there where people go and walk their dogs and can go and sit. So you have got the nice, idyllic, peaceful park only a short distance away.
But the peace is shattered on one summer's day. At 12:20 p.m, police are called to an address in Sincil Bank.
When police arrived at the scene, they found a body of a woman that had been badly beaten. She had appeared to have been beaten with a blunt object.
The crime scene is secured.
The police came, they cornered off the streets, you weren't allowed anywhere near your houses and stuff. No one really told us what happened.
A murder investigation is immediately launched, and it's not long before the body is identified as 29-year-old student Mingzi Yang. But who is Mingzi, and how had she become a victim of such a brutal murder?
Mingzi Yang was originally from China. She came to the UK in 2008, and she was studying English at Lincoln College. Initially, she lived in the Humberside area, and in 2012, she moved to the address in Sincil Bank, where she lived with her partner, who she'd met fairly recently, Darren Grundy, and her young 5-year-old son.
Mingzi's son was from a previous relationship, but Darren quickly became part of the family.
As a couple, they were engaged to be married and were due to get married the following year.
But on the 17th of June, Darren had grown increasingly worried throughout the day when Mingzi failed to answer her phone.
He'd gone to work and he'd been trying to get hold of her throughout the day and without any success. So he left work early and made his way to the address.
Darren arrives home and makes a shocking discovery.
He found a scene of devastation, really. It looked like it had been ransacked. It looked like there'd maybe been a burglary. There was a lot of blood in the address, and he discovered Mingzi's body.
And then he raised the alarm and the police were contacted.
As the police begin their investigation, they need to establish what Mingzi's last known movements were on the day of her murder.
Detectives will use a phrase sometimes that says if you find out how a person lived, then you'll find out how they died. It's about building up a detailed picture of that victim, because somewhere in there might just be the answer as to why this has happened and who's committed it. On the morning of the 17th of June, she'd gone and took her young son to the local primary school, which was a very short walk away, and returned to the address.
The killing was believed to have taken place in broad daylight, early in the morning after school, although the body wasn't discovered until Mr. Grundy raised the alarm.
The question is, who could possibly have wanted to harm Mingzi?
First thing that would go through my head is to try and establish exactly what has gone on.
The initial mystery for the police was that the house had been ransacked. There had been a burglary, and that possibly an intruder had killed Mingzi Yang.
News that a possible burglary has turned into a murder sends shockwaves across the local community.
There was fear and a sense of shock, because it's not something that happens with frequency in Lincoln at all. And the big fear is that our community is then under threat.
I remember hearing about it. My mum and my dad told me about it, and it was very upsetting. It's very traumatic knowing that it's basically on your front door. You know, you could go to sleep at night and something bad could happen. This could have been my mum, or this could have been my sister, or this could have been a relative that lives across the road.
Everybody was massively scared of what had happened because it was so close to home. It's 2 minutes away from the pub that I run. So that day, customers were coming in absolutely shocked and stunned with all the police cordons. It just is unheard of around here. You just can't believe that it's happened.
There was a genuine fear from people who lived in the local area that a burglar or intruder was at large and had carried out such a devastating crime in broad daylight. Neighbours were obviously concerned that this could possibly happen to them.
In the Lincoln suburb of Sincil Bank, the community is shocked to hear of the murder of 29-year-old mum, Mingzi Yang, who has been beaten to death in her own home in what looks like a robbery gone wrong.
She was a local student. She'd got a child. We just couldn't believe that somebody like her had been killed.
And the fear on the streets is growing.
A lot of people are scared of living around here, knowing that something really bad's happened, and it's on your front door.
The first feeling is one of shock, and then wanting to know really what had happened. Was the public at risk?
When something like this happens in the community, there's a massive impact. There's lots of children and families in this area, so to have something so tragic and awful happening on your doorstep, it strikes fear throughout everybody.
That's all we were talking about. Everybody was just in utter disbelief that something like that could happen so close to home.
And a lot of them will have been friendly with Mingzi Yang in any event, so apart from the personal impact, you really do get a build-up of tension throughout the community. People feel understandably frightened. Who's committed it? Why have they committed it? Are they going to come back and do it again? If it is a burglary, is our house going to be the next target?
With such a brutal murder happening on a busy street, police are taken aback at the boldness of the crime.
Mingzi had a young son who had been dropped off at school, and the killing was believed to have taken place sometime between about 9 and 10 a.m.
The fact that this has happened in broad daylight, at a time when people are taking their children to school, in a place like this, which appears quite peaceful and tranquil, is actually quite shocking.
The idea that an intruder had managed to get into this house unnoticed and carry out this killing was obviously very frightening for local people.
With the attack suspected to have occurred early in the day, police reach out to the locals for any potential information that may lead them to Mingzi's attacker.
You're really looking for witnesses. Something that's happened like that with so many injuries and so much devastation within the house would presumably have made some noise. You know, had she been screaming and shouting for help? Have the neighbours heard or seen anything? In a case like this, in an area like this, the community are absolutely vital. They are the eyes and ears, and they're going to know things and see things that the police will never get to find out about. So it's really important to get out in amongst the community and make yourself visible and ask those important questions, because just by being here, you may be approached by a member of the public who tells you something that in isolation might seem quite minor, but actually, when you put it together as part of a jigsaw puzzle, it could actually help to solve the case.
Local reporter Richard Van Plu is also on the scene.
The first time I became aware of Mingzi's death was when the police put out a press release saying that the body of a woman had been found. Killings like this, obviously in rural areas, don't happen every day, and people are quite rightly shocked. And sometimes when you arrive at the scene, people will talk to you. It's their main way of dealing with what's happened.
But so far, door-to-door inquiries have uncovered no leads to Mingzi's attacker. With the fear in the area growing, forensics arrived to examine the scene.
When I arrived at the scene, it was a shocking sight. Mingzi was face upwards and she was covered in blood. She was in the main living room. There was large, pooled, smeared blood staining on the carpet all around Mingzi's body. There was a white radiator near where Mingzi's body was found, and there was spots of blood spattered onto the white radiator. The smears and pools of blood along the carpet had indicated to me that she'd been assaulted at one end of the room, and she was on the floor crawling towards the kitchen in an attempt to escape. The blood spatters on the radiator and on the adjacent wall indicated that as she was crawling along, she was being hit with a blunt instrument repeatedly.
Post-mortem results then arrive, which further adds to the horrific nature of Mingzi's death.
A post-mortem found Mingzi's injuries were quite severe.
She had numerous injuries, more than 20 in total, mainly to her head. She also had, interestingly enough, some defence wounds, including a fracture to one of her hands, which clearly indicated that she'd been trying to fend the attacker off. But the actual number of injuries and the nature of those injuries were very, very severe, and would only ever have resulted in one thing, which was her death. She'd basically been battered to death.
But as police scour the scene and surrounding areas, there is no sign of the murder weapon.
The weapon used was believed to be a very hard, heavy, blunt object. But interestingly enough, it wasn't recovered from the scene, which suggests that potentially the offender may have possibly brought it with them, but certainly taken it away with them, which does suggest a degree of premeditation and planning and the realisation, even in the moment of everything happening, that actually they might have left some evidence on that weapon.
Police start to suspect that their initial theory, that Mingzi disturbed a burglar who then attacked her, could be wrong. This is reinforced when detectives examine Mingzi's possessions.
Burglary is normally where somebody goes in and steals something. Sounds fairly obvious, but that's what happens. So if there were items in that house, such as TVs, electrical goods, jewellery, cash, you would expect someone that's committing a burglary to take those. The fact that items didn't appear to be missing is really important.
And new forensic evidence casts further doubt that Mingzi disturbed a burglary taking place.
The perpetrator had gone upstairs and opened a number of drawers, which made it look like a burglary. However, the intruder had done this after he'd assaulted Mingzi. We know that because Mingzi's blood was on the stairs in the form of footwear marks, and her blood was on the drawers in the form of finger marks, glove marks in blood. In my mind, your average burglar, if they're startled, they're just going to want to get out of the property. They don't want to harm anybody. They just don't want to get caught. Why would a perpetrator repeatedly beat Mingzi and then take the risk of going upstairs to see if they could find something in her bedroom It just didn't quite add up.
By re-examining the post-mortem results, police suspect this attack may actually have been carried out by someone closer to home.
The nature and the number of injuries and the fact that they were all caused to Minxie's head area is a suggestion that perhaps this is a little bit more personal. It's almost like a humiliation and perhaps not just a stranger attack or a burglar that's been disturbed.
Considering the nature of Mingsy's injuries, the police would have to consider whether this was an argument that had gone wrong.
In the majority of murder cases, there is some kind of connection between the victim and the offender.
90% of murders are committed by people who know the victim, and normally very closely.
As police begin to suspect that Mingsy could have known her attacker and that whoever it was had a grudge against her, they look to her previous relationships, beginning with her ex-husband, 33-year-old Wai Hong Sang.
Police contacted Mr. Sang. He lived in the Grimsby area. He was a chemistry graduate with dual nationality, so he was a Brit as well as Chinese. He had gone through a recent divorce with Mingsy, and they shared a son together.
Police want to know where Zhang was on the day his ex-wife was murdered.
Mr. Sang was asked to provide a written statement of his movements on the 17th. He disclosed to police that he had taken the day off work.
Zhang's statement explains why he took the day off and outlines a clear alibi for the time Mingsy was murdered.
He had the day off work and he went to Sherwood Pines in the Nottingham area where he went trail biking.
And he could provide car parking tickets and receipts to back this up.
With a solid alibi and evidence to prove it, Zhang is discounted from the inquiries. So police shift their focus elsewhere, and to one person in particular.
The police, they would be examining who Mingsy had spoken to, who were the last people that had seen her. Obviously, in this case, Darren Grundy was virtually living at Mingsy Yang's address.
Darren Grundy would likely to have been the last person to see Mingsy Yang alive. He's the person who's in a current relationship with her. He's the person who discovered the body.
Mingsy Yang's fiancé, Darren Grundy, is taken in for questioning. And it isn't long before the police make an announcement.
Darren Grundy is arrested on suspicion of the murder of Mingsy Yang. He's taken into police custody, and the police think that they have their man.
All of Darren's clothing was seized and submitted to the laboratory for examination.
The police were convinced it obviously had the hallmarks of a crime of passion.
It's been 24 hours since the body of 29-year-old student Mingsy Yang was discovered at her home in the Lincoln suburb of Sinsel Bank. And police have arrested her fiancé, 32-year-old Darren Grundy, on suspicion of murder.
Darren Grundy was the person that reported her death and was also possibly the last person to see her alive.
He was taken into police custody, during which time he's questioned and the police seek to gather further evidence and information to strengthen their case.
Police believe the attack on Mingsy was carried out by someone who knew her.
Police were convinced that this was a crime of passion. It's not unusual with crimes of passion that the victim is badly beaten. Mingsy had been beaten and sustained over 20 injuries.
The hallmarks of a crime of passion, I would say, are extreme violence, humiliation, degradation, that sort of thing. Doing something that's really personal, so, destroying something that really means a lot to somebody. And often it is extreme, gratuitous violence where there's clearly been some kind of loss of self-control because it is such a personal issue.
Now in police custody, Darren faces intense questioning from detectives.
The interview of a murder suspect is different from the interview of a witness. It's far more detailed, The officers that interview a murder suspect will be specially trained, and they use tactics and techniques with the intention of getting as much information as possible. During the interviews, Darren Grundy maintains that he went to work that day and he was trying to get hold of Ming-Si Yang during the day. He couldn't get hold of her, so he decided to leave work early, and he came home from work early and he found her dead in the home.
But police aren't convinced by his account and detain him further.
In order to hold someone in custody for more than 36 hours, the police need to go to a magistrate's court in order to keep that person in custody. So this is a serious situation for Darren Grundy. He's in custody, and obviously the police think that they have their man.
When police receive forensic results from Darren Grundy's clothing, the findings change the course of the investigation.
When we looked at Darren's clothing in the laboratory, there was no blood spattering on there. The blood staining on him was quite minimal, and it's not what I would expect from the perpetrator. I would expect to find a lot of small spots of blood on the perpetrator's clothing, especially around his lower legs. If you imagine when Ming-Si's moving around the room and she's being constantly struck, the blood is spattering onto that radiator. Those small spots of blood will also spatter back onto the assailant. Didn't see anything like that at all on Darren's clothing.
But then a member of the public comes forward with some information that turns the case on its head.
The Sincilbank area of Lincoln is a very tight-knit community, and following the news of Ming-Si's death, the teenage boy who was in the Sincilbank area on the morning of Ming-Si's murder did come forward. He reported to police that he had seen a cyclist loitering very closely to the back passage of Ming-Si's address.
The young boy saw a man on the pedal cycle cycling around this area, and he actually saw him go into an alleyway, which is where the address in question is.
He remembered clearly that that cyclist was wearing a blue workman's helmet rather than a cycling helmet. He made eye contact with the cyclist and then watched as he wheeled that bike into Ming-Si's passageway.
But who was the cyclist? And could they be responsible for Ming-Si's murder? The physical description the boy gives narrows down his identity.
This key witness reported to police the cyclist was also of East Asian appearance. The police now had to explore people who knew Ming-Si matching that description.
And at this point, the police become aware that actually they've been looking at the wrong man. And they focus their inquiries in a different direction.
Darren Grundy is released without charge. And attention now falls on an individual from Ming-Si's past.
The description of the cyclist matched Ming-Si's ex-husband, Mr. Sang.
Wai Hong Sang had already provided police with a convincing alibi, saying he was over 40 miles from Ming-Si's home on the day of her murder, enjoying a day out biking at Sherwood Pines Forest.
Mr. Sang has a solid alibi. He'd travelled to Sherwood Pines, where he had spent the day trail biking. So police are then tasked with establishing his movements exactly and whether it is possible that this cyclist could be Mr. Sang. In the eyes of the investigation, there is obviously a big difference between police suspecting that this cyclist may be Mr. Sang and may have committed the murder, but proving it to a jury is obviously a whole different matter.
In an attempt to track down the mysterious individual spotted by a local teenager, police trawl through thousands of hours of CCTV from across Lincoln.
There are so many CCTV cameras now, private, local authority. People have them on their houses as well. It's a real critical part of any murder investigation. The police will be looking at trying to find that person at that location or as close as possible, and then trying to find where they went from there. Where did the cyclist come from? ideally, what did they do whilst they were in the area, and then where did they go afterwards?
And after hours of rigorous detective work, police finally spot the cyclist.
What it actually showed was that this particular cyclist, who was quite distinctive in description, particularly with a hat that he was wearing, was picked up on 40 separate occasions in 16 different locations in and around the Lincoln City area. The route of the cyclist was quite clear from the footage that he'd come into the city in the early hours of the morning, then made his way out of the city again.
The man is seen cycling away from Lincoln just after 9 a.m, around 3 hours before Mingzi's body was discovered. Detectives analysed the footage to see if the cyclist in question is indeed Mingzi's ex-husband, Wai Hong Sang.
One of the main difficulties in proving identity of someone on CCTV is the quality of the footage. It's vastly improved since many years ago when it was really poor, but you still do have systems now, for one reason or another, that are not particularly clear. They're grainy. You may struggle to identify someone.
With the identity of the cyclist still unclear from the CCTV footage, police bring Sang in for questioning.
The police will be looking at his background, his movements, and his relationship, trying to gather as much information. They'll be looking at inconsistencies with his account, and it may be that he can't give certain information. So they'll be trying to build up a case against him using the factual information that they know and anything which can either confirm or disprove his account.
Under caution, Sang gives the same account he provided in his written statement.
Wei Sang told the police that he had gone to Sherwood Pines in Nottingham. He'd driven straight there from his home address in Grimsby, and he'd been there for the duration of the day. He was also able to produce some receipts from parking in the Nottingham area and a petrol receipt as well.
Despite Sang providing receipts to prove his alibi, police attempt to investigate his digital footprint by looking into his phone activity on the day.
He had turned his phone off when he left home, which he said was the usual thing that he would do when he was going trail biking.
So what the police decided to do instead was to examine the sat-nav on his car.
And what officers discover reveals a major hole in Sang's story.
The inbuilt car sat-nav actually showed that he hadn't gone directly from Grimsby to Nottingham, but he'd driven from Grimsby to Lincoln, where he'd parked in a lay-by for at least 2 hours, and then afterwards had then gone to Nottingham. So there was a huge hole in the alibi.
It's a shocking revelation. Police now know Sang was parked up in a lay-by on the outskirts of Lincoln on the day of Mingzi's murder. Could it be that Sang had cycled from this location to Mingzi's home in Sinsel Bank? Police look again at the CCTV of the suspicious cyclist.
The analysis of the cyclist and the CCTV showed quite clearly with the times involved that he would have had the opportunity to have parked his vehicle in the outskirts of Lincoln, cycled into Lincoln to Mingzi's address, killed Mingzi, and then cycled back out of the city again, back to his car, and then driven to Sherwood Pines in Nottingham, where he claimed that he'd been all day.
This key CCTV evidence proved Mr. Sang did have the time available to cycle into Lincoln and murder his ex-wife.
But the CCTV footage is still unable to prove if Wai Hong Sang was at Mingzi's home on the day of the murder. The only evidence police have is circumstantial and unlikely to hold up in court. But then, forensic results from a search at Sang's address return from the lab.
The police submit various items for forensic examination from Wai Sang. There were items which were actually purchased after he'd separated from Mingzi Yang.
We examined a number of items from him, including a watch, The watch, when you looked at it with a naked eye, it didn't look as though there was anything on it at all. So I think the watch had probably been cleaned. But in the laboratory, once we could look at it using a low power microscope, we could manipulate the hinges, the links, and you could see that in between the links there were some small blood stains. Those samples of blood stains were then subject to DNA profiling tests, and the blood was attributable to Mingzi.
As well as the traces of Mingzi's blood found on her ex-husband's watch, further shocking evidence is found on a bicycle belonging to Sang.
The bike that we examined was a different bicycle from the bike in the CCTV, but it was in the car on the day. The initial visual examination of that bicycle, we couldn't find any blood. But once we got it in the laboratory with specialised lighting and the low power microscope, there was a small blood stain that was located on the handlebar. Again, that was subject to DNA profiling test, and that came back blood attributable to Mingzi. So from my examination of these objects, it was obvious that he has tried to cover all of his tracks, and he has done so quite successfully because we've only found these two small blood stains. We examined many other items from that individual and didn't find anything on them. And he's obviously done a good job of covering his tracks, but these minute traces left in these difficult to locate areas is what indicated that he was the perpetrator.
Wai Hong Sang is charged with the murder of his ex-wife, Mingzi Yang.
The police have circumstantial evidence. They have Wei Sang in Lincoln, in the area at the time of the murder. They have the forensic evidence that links him as well. What they haven't got is a specific motive or a reason why he's committed this awful attack on his ex-wife.
Police obviously believed they had their man, but now they had to prove a motive. Why had Mr. Sang chosen to kill his ex-wife?
"33-year-old Wai Hong Sang has been charged with the murder of his ex-wife, 29-year-old Mingzi Yang, in the Sinselbank area of Lincoln. Having pleaded not guilty, the case is sent for trial.
Mr. Sang's trial was heard at Lincoln Crown Court, which is a very old courtroom in the grounds of Lincoln Castle. It is all a wood panel building. The judge sits high above the courtroom in a wooden seat. The defendant sits opposite in the dock, and witnesses give evidence to his right. It is a very personal experience for everybody in the room.
As any officer involved in a murder case, you always will feel an amount of apprehension before a murder trial, because no matter how strong the case appears to be, and no matter how happy you are with how the investigation has gathered pace and been concluded at that point, there's always an opportunity and a chance that something could come up during the trial that could change the direction of things. And even if it is a technicality or something that doesn't directly impinge on the actual case itself, sometimes that can be something that influences a jury in a kind of negative way.
As the trial begins, local reporter Richard Van Plu observes Mingzi's alleged killer in the courtroom.
Sang was very composed. He was obviously a very intelligent man and was following the proceedings intently, but showed little emotion.
The prosecution opens their case against Sang.
The prosecution presented a strong case, backed by the CCTV evidence and the sat-nav evidence, but it wasn't an overwhelming case.
The prosecution in the case were looking to show that there was a degree of pre-planning and preparation in this case, the way that Wei Sang had behaved, the fact that he'd lied about where he'd been, that he came to Lincoln in his vehicle, then came on his pedal cycle into the city centre. The fact that there were so many injuries inflicted on Ming-Si Yang. It was clearly a personal attack, and it was clearly something that he'd planned, and he'd tried to cover his tracks very carefully.
The pathology evidence presented at trial showed that the injury that most likely killed Ming-Si was a brutal wound to the head. But the murder weapon was never recovered, and the prosecution suggested that this meant it was carried out by somebody with premeditation who had taken that weapon away and made sure that it wasn't found.
To the courtroom's surprise, Tsang agrees to give evidence.
As a journalist in the courtroom, you sit in a wood-panelled seat right next to the witness box, where Mr. Tsang gave evidence. And confronted by the evidence from the sat-nav, Tsang gave an account that he did leave his car in the lay-by near Lincoln. This differed from the account that he initially gave the police.
Tsang agrees that yes, he did go to Lincoln, but rather than going into Lincoln City on a push bike, he said that he drove to the outskirts of Lincoln, he parked in a lay-by, and he slept for a couple of hours.
And the reason he gave for not telling the police this during his first account was that he didn't want his new partner to find out that he'd been sleeping.
The prosecution confronts Tsang with the CCTV footage from the day of the murder. They are convinced this is Tsang heading towards Sinsel Bank.
Tsang was adamant that the cyclist in the blue work helmet was not him, and that he remained in his car asleep on the outskirts of Lincoln.
Wei Tsang denies being the person on the pedal cycle. He simply says it's not him.
Despite the overwhelming forensic evidence against Tsang, the court are yet to hear a motive behind the killing. But then, details of Ming-Si and Tsang's marriage are revealed to the jury.
It's revealed that there was a history of coercion and abuse from Wei Tsang against Ming-Si Yang. It's been going on for some time before they actually divorced. Domestic abuse, it's very rarely isolated. It's something that will often go on perhaps for years. I read a statistic recently that said that there were 50 incidents of domestic abuse that would normally occur before someone calls for help. And the victim will often put up with abuse or coercion for a long period of time before they eventually come to the point where they actually ask for help. Ming-Si Yang had actually reported previous incidents of domestic abuse to Humberside Police on 3 separate occasions before she moved to Lincoln, and actually before Darren Grundy had come onto the scene.
In 2012, Ming-Si divorced from Tsang and moved to Lincoln to start a new life for herself. The pair then only saw each other when handing over their son to one another as part of an arrangement made by the court. The abuse that she had suffered appeared to have ended. But then, relations with her former husband took a sudden drop.
During the trial, it was established that the divorce between Ming-Si and Tsang had not been straightforward. There had been some disagreements over the custody of their son. And obviously, that is something that can raise very high emotions.
Ming-Si and Tsang had initially settled on shared custody of their son. But in the lead up to that fateful morning, it appears Ming-Si had put in motion plans to end this.
They shared custody, but the prosecution put the motive on the basis that he got a letter a few days before where she wanted more custody of their son.
Wei Tsang had received at least one letter in relation to those custody arrangements, so it's believed that actually Ming-Si Yang was looking to see more of her son, and Wei Tsang wasn't happy with that, and this potentially was the reason why he killed her. In my experience, in a case involving children and personal relationships, it can be something on the face of it quite simple, and in isolation perhaps not as serious, that can send somebody over the edge. Could potentially be a build-up of tension and stress over a period of time, and the person just kind of snaps.
In January 2015, the jury at Lincoln Crown Court returns its verdict. Wai Hong Zhang is found guilty of Mingzi Yang's murder. He is sentenced to a minimum of 28 years in prison.
At the end of the trial, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the charge of murder. They were obviously convinced by the prosecution case and returned an extremely quick verdict for a murder case. They took just 2 hours to find Zhang guilty.
Wai Zhang, I would say, was a cold-hearted individual, self-centred, deceitful, and clearly very violent.
But with his cleverly constructed alibi, initially deceiving police, was there a chance that Zhang could have walked away with murder?
This case stands out because the murderer prepared a very clever alibi before carrying out the killing. It is not unusual for people to try and create an alibi after they carry out a murder or a killing. But in my career as a crime reporter, there are probably only 2 or 3 other cases where someone has gone to such great lengths.
He's sat down and thought this through. He's obviously an intelligent person. He's covered his tracks. He just tells me that, yeah, he is that kind of cold, calculated kind of a person.
If it wasn't for the blood on the bike and the watch, although he is on the outskirts of Lincoln, it's not beyond reasonable doubt that a jury could have been convinced that he wasn't a cyclist.
The case really turned on the forensic evidence. You know, he may well have got away with that murder in years gone by, but fortunately with the advances in forensic science and the specialist CCTV that's available and the experts nowadays, he was quite rightly tracked down and sentenced.
If this murder had happened 30 years ago, at the start of my career, it's probably quite unlikely that he would have been convicted.
With Zhang now behind bars, the community reflects on the impact Mingzi's death has had on her family.
It's so traumatic. She was so young and she moved here, she wanted a better life, but she hasn't witnessed the whole life yet.
I think this case is shocking in terms of the level and the nature of the injuries. The sentence reflects the seriousness of the offence. Hopefully it may bring some small comfort to Mingzi's family moving forward. But at the end of the day, nothing will bring Mingzi Yang back, and it leaves a young boy growing up without his mother.
Shocking true crime Wednesday at 9 on Sky Mix, when a victim of circumstance is in the wrong place at the wrong time in You Murdered at First Sight.
I'd never heard anybody say a wrong word about her.
Didn't seem to me like she's got any enemies in the world.
Cheshire Fire and Rescue received a call of multiple fires at the property.
News of a devastating fire in the Cheshire countryside.
Once those fires had died down, there was no sign of her.
Where is the owner, and are they safe?
When the deceased is found, clearly the state of the body, how it's been found, clearly a murder from the off.
I can't believe anybody would treat Diane like that.
Police believe she was murdered and then her home deliberately set alight.
In the middle of the Cheshire countryside lies a quite quaint hamlet. Cranage.
It's quite an affluent area in parts. There's some big houses. There's a lot of farms around there, quite isolated at parts, and dairy farms, chicken farms. As well as being quite small, there's obviously the classic community feel towards it, whereby everybody knows everyone, and that's pretty much central to a place like Cranage.
The area is a really desirable place to live. I mean, a lot of people with a lot of money want to come and share what we've got out here. You know, we've got quite a lot of famous footballers in the area.
It's a lovely area, and it's just a nice area to live.
In the heart of the village sits Parklands Cattery, run by popular local Diana Lee.
Diane was a lovely girl that would always help people out. Very, very conscientious, very bright. You never saw her without a smile on her face. She was always very bubbly and just a lovely person. I'd never heard anybody say a wrong word about her.
She was always such a lovely lady, very full of the joys of spring, and didn't seem to me like she's got any enemies in the world. You know, she's that type of really likeable person.
Originally from Tabley, Diana moved to Cranage in 2008 and opened her own cattery business. And it thrived.
Diane opened the business with an ex-partner at the property and been quite successful in doing so. That partner then left that business and she continued to run the cattery on her own.
But Parklands wasn't just any cattery. It was the creme de la creme of the feline world.
She loved cats, and that's why she created the business that she did do, which was probably a little bit unique to Cheshire and this environment. So, offering TVs and beds, sort of prices at probably slightly higher than maybe other areas of the country. So, yeah, I mean, that showed probably her caring side more than anything else.
I think anybody that wanted to trust anybody with their animal, you'd only have to be in the presence of Diane for a few minutes, and you'd soon be contented the mind that your animal would be in safe hands and well looked after, well cared for, because she's just that caring nature.
Diana lived in a large gated detached property next door to her cattery, but she didn't live alone.
Being a big property at Parklands, Diana had a lodger who lived with her at that time, probably a bit of company and also to help with the income coming in and to upkeep such a large property and the business as well.
On the 8th of August 2012, Diana meets friends for dinner, something which she often does in her spare time.
Diana met up with some friends in Knutsford at the Manzan Chinese restaurant on King Street, where she spent the evening with them.
She got a lot of friends, Diane had, and she'd be out with different groups of friends quite a lot.
But little does Diana know, that evening with friends is to change life forever and leave a lasting scar on the close-knit community.
11 a.m, Cheshire Fire and Rescue received a call of multiple fires at a property in Cranage.
This scene was discovered through a family relative going to the address. They go to the house, they see fire coming from, smoke coming from the house and the garage. A neighbour was alerted who rang the fire brigade.
Emergency services arrive and work tirelessly to put out the fire.
Once those fires had died down and they'd been treated with, they'd realised that Diana's car wasn't at the property and there was no sign of her.
That's the main concern for the police, would be where is the owner and are they safe? The police have got a report of a fire. You've got a relative who's turned up who can't find the owner. Clearly a number of seats of fire. Straight away you'd be thinking there's something suspicious regarding this, particularly if you're looking at an affluent property like we've got here.
The fire experts are going to be looking at whether it's a deliberately set fire, whether it appears to be an electrical fire, whether it's potentially a chip pan that's gone over, and as soon as the idea that a fire has been deliberately set, everyone's mind goes into very suspicious.
Fire officers keep searching the property grounds and enter the adjacent garage. And what they find changes the course of the investigation.
They found her body at the property, and at that point, police were called to investigate.
When Diana's body was discovered, the most obvious thing that would be clear to the first attenders is that the body was, certainly on the surface, badly burnt. That raises a whole number of possible scenarios. An accident, misadventure.
Cheshire police immediately arrive at the scene.
In the time I've served in the police as an investigator, I've been involved with many inquiries. The early priorities are the scene, first scene where the victim is.
But it's where Diana's body is that raises suspicion. She is found lying face down on a wheelbarrow. She is naked, covered in shredded paper and bedding. Her body battered with horrific injuries.
When the deceased is found, clearly the state of the body, how it's been found, is clearly a murder from the off.
Police believe the extent of the injuries are not just caused by the fire, so a murder investigation is launched.
The most important thing is to preserve the scene. The slightest disturbance of a scene, by trampling through it, walking through it innocently, it causes contamination. So that's really, really important to make sure that it's cordoned off.
You only get one go at recovering evidence from a body, and one that is already compromised. There will be a lot of discussion about what should be sampled at the scene, what should be done at the scene, what is going to be compromised by another action. So there will be a lot of effort going into preserving as much evidence as possible.
News of the shocking crime spreads quickly through the close-knit community.
I can't believe anybody would treat Diane like that and do so much harm. It just seems horrendous. I just can't comprehend it.
In the quiet, quaint village of Cranage, the community is shocked at the news of a murder. But the previous evening, August 8th, started off like a normal night out for 54-year-old Diana Lee. At 8 p.m, Diana met up with friends and had dinner in a local Chinese restaurant. According to friends, she said goodbye to them at 10:15 p.m. before driving home. Early the following morning, Diana sent a text to a friend.
Diana's phone records on the morning of her death showed that she'd texted a friend saying she wasn't feeling very well, she's feeling sick, and that she'd like her to collect a cat later in the day.
But just a few hours later, her property was engulfed in flames.
Fire brigade and the police attend, and they find the horrible scene in the garage of the victim.
She was found dead in her home, and police had opened a murder investigation.
News of the horrific attack quickly spreads.
The call came through from a contact who had been driving past the area saying there was lots of activity in Cranage itself, so we decided to come down. When we came down here, there was essentially fire, pumps, as well as emergency services, police and ambulance as well. Whenever you have a scene of maybe 3 or 4 police vehicles and 4 fire engines, you know that something's pretty serious. The tape was quite high up. They'd sort of cordoned off here, and it was difficult to get any closer than this, really. But obviously, there's lots of residents coming down here, trying to find out what had been taking place.
And the quiet village of Cranage is now the centre of an atrocious crime, and fear spreads that there's a killer on the loose.
The feeling in the community was just of absolute shock, a disbelief that, things like murders don't happen around here.
I think from the outset it was shock more than anything, and for it to happen for these residents on what is their doorstep was probably a big shock to them.
The fears for a community is who would do such an awful crime, and they're still out there. Could they strike again?
There was a real lack of understanding of that somebody could do this.
The question crossing the community's mind: who could have murdered Diana, and why?
Certainly, any murder, there's rumour and speculation about the victim and the motive for a murder, or who could have done it.
Some murders are spontaneous, a lot of it is finance. So you'd be looking at straight away what the lady does for a living. Is the money owed? Has it just been a random targeted attack by some local or someone travelling?
Police need to act fast, so they search the house. But they quickly come across a startling piece of evidence.
There was evidence of the victim's clothing in the lodger's bedroom, and also a blood-stained knife which belonged to the lodger. So he's got access to the house, he's got access to the garage. He may have been in a relationship with this lady. So you've got to treat that individual as a suspect. You would have to arrest them.
With such obvious evidence potentially linking the lodger to the crime, police need to establish his movements in the hours Diana was last seen alive.
From their point of view, it's a case of trying to find out their background, where they were at the time of the incident, what they'd been up to, trying to find all sorts of reasons why they could have committed a crime such as this one.
The lodger tells detectives that he last saw Diana at 7:30 p.m. in the garden before she left in her car to have dinner with friends in Knutsford. He goes on to say that he left for work at 6 a.m. and remembers seeing Diana's car parked on the driveway. While police unpick the lodger's alibi to see if it stacks up, the team on the ground make a breakthrough discovery.
They found that Diana's car had been abandoned 10 miles away in Mobley. At that point, they'd also had reports from a taxi driver who had seen a man acting suspicious in the area, who'd also tried to torch the vehicle before running off.
A witness came forward, a taxi driver, to say that he'd seen someone trying to set fire to the car. He challenged the driver, and the driver made off on a bike, and then he's made off on fields. So again, the push bike would be a scene, and there'd be searches going around that area.
Was this man Diana's lodger? And had he driven Diana's car 10 miles north? But while police gather evidence, another arrest is made.
It was a person who was known to Diana, who'd been an ex-partner, who had been convicted previously of a charge against her. He had convictions against Diana in terms of beating her.
There were two immediate suspects, two men who were in her life. So there was a lodger, and there was some circumstantial evidence that suggested that he was not all he said he was. And then there was a very violent ex who had actually been imprisoned for attacking her. So two quite strong suspects.
But police are soon able to confirm Diana's lodger was at work the entire day from 6 a.m, hours before the fire had started. He is released without charge. And with the items of evidence found in his room, detectives now suspect the lodger was set up for murder. But by who? With Diana's ex still in custody, police take a more in-depth look at him and his whereabouts.
A large proportion of domestic murders is sometimes it's an ex-partner. Clearly the ex-partner was a prime suspect very early on. The motive is he knows the victim, it's previous violent history towards the victim, so straight away you'd be alarm bells going.
We were all pretty convinced who'd actually done this.
The local community recall Diana had once lived a life in fear from her ex.
Somebody that she'd known was banned from being in the area, and she knew that he'd been at the house. Certain things had moved, and she was petrified, and she gave me a call, and I went down to have a look to see if there was anybody there. I'd never seen anybody so petrified.
And the location of Diana's car further cements police suspicions. It was dumped between her house and that of her ex's.
The investigating officers realised that the car had been found in a location that was en route to the person, so it probably made sense in their minds that, again, he was the person who had committed this crime.
Questioning of Diana's ex intensifies.
Is he still in contact? Where does he live? What were his movements for the day or the time of the murder, to eliminate them from the inquiry?
So after a couple of days of speaking to the person who they'd arrested, it quickly became apparent that that individual had a solid alibi.
With his whereabouts on the night of Diana's murder confirmed, her ex-partner is released. Having followed strong leads and had 2 potential suspects, detectives are back to square one.
And it was a case whereby the police had to reappeal for information. It was a case of them having come across a bit of a dead end and having to start again to see who had committed this crime.
But post-mortem results come in and help police identify the cause of her death. Could this provide further clues to her attacker?
If somebody has died before a fire, then you will sometimes see soot in the mouth, you will sometimes see it as far as the larynx. But to get it down into the lungs, somebody has to be breathing. Answer that vital question, was this person alive when the fire was burning? And you'll be seeing that she hasn't inhaled soot. She hasn't inhaled the products of combustion. All of this is pointing to her being dead and then set alight, rather than either a deliberate act by herself or some sort of strange accident with solvents. She died of head injuries, so there was clear evidence of bleeding in the head resulting from impacts. That is very different to what you see if there's simply damage to the head from it being heated in a fire.
Police now know Diana died before her lifeless body was dumped and the garage set alight, meaning the killer tried to cover his tracks.
DNA will be damaged by the heat that the fire produces, but certainly trace evidence, if one looks hard enough, it can be recovered.
Forensics locate a small amount of unknown DNA on Diana. And there's something else.
There's no self-defense wounds. That information from the pathologist would clearly indicate generally that she knew the person was there with consent in the property, and that they weren't expecting that trauma to be caused to them.
Detectives now believe Diana's killer was known to her, so need to delve into her private life and turn to the community for help.
Community is key to any murder inquiry because they're the eyes and ears, and they probably hold evidence what they don't know at the time.
I get the feeling, as you do in so many of these cases, that Diana was actually quite a vulnerable person. She was living alone. She was probably fairly happy, having come out of an abusive and violent relationship. She was building things up again.
Maybe the situation arose where she was probably too trusting of somebody.
Friends express their concerns that perhaps all was not as it seemed in Diana's life.
I should imagine she was easily taken advantage of in a financial way because she was quite a wealthy lady. A few times when I saw her passing, she seemed like very troubled, as though she wasn't her usual self, and she was obviously hiding something that she was really concerned about, but she never really told me the full extent of it, and that was a bit of a worry for me, you know, what was going on with her. But I think most people would have realised something was not quite right, but because she was a private person, she didn't really explain to me exactly what was going on. And I just said to her, if you ever have any problems, you must report things if there's something you need to report. But she wouldn't tell me anything in detail or anything.
With those close to Diana unable to shed light on her private life, the investigation intensifies, and police expand their search, trawling through local businesses and residential CCTV on the night Diana was last seen alive.
CCTV is huge on any major incident and murder inquiry, whether it's from the local council's CCTV, the police ANPR cameras, and then people's own CCTV from shops, businesses and private CCTV. A lot of the houses in this area will have their own CCTV. And if you get a fleeting glance of a vehicle or a person, that is key to an inquiry to identify people who have been at the scene.
So for the police officers investigating this case, they had a bit of a break when they found the CCTV footage on King Street of Diana leaving the restaurant, but at the same time they were left slightly puzzled by her movements, which were caught on an ANPR camera, which saw her headed away from her home address in Cranage and towards the Altrincham area of Greater Manchester.
What the police couldn't account for is about 45 minutes in between her leaving her friends and arriving home. So that gap in time was something that the police really needed to find out. Where was she going? Who was she seeing? Who was she meeting? That 45 minutes for the police would have been absolutely crucial because nobody could explain where she'd gone. So there was something in Diana's life that the police didn't know about.
With this latest piece of information, police looked closely at Diana's phone records and noticed something suspicious.
So as the officers trawled through Diana's phone records, they found a number that she'd been communicating with on a regular occurrence, but had stopped doing so in January of that year.
Is another suspect in their sights?
That number belonged to a David Ryan, who lived in Hale in Greater Manchester.
It's been several weeks since local Diana Lee was found murdered in her home in Cranage. Police have questioned and released 2 men known to Diana, and 13 days after her body was discovered, police released an e-fit.
The police issued an e-fit of someone who they wanted to speak to. That individual was a person who was with the Corsa, which was seen trying to set fire to it and then made off on a push bike. It's really important that people try and recall what they were doing that day at that time, because they may have seen that offender leaving the scene.
With officers waiting for tip-offs from members of the public following the release of the e-fit, and having eliminated 2 suspects that are known to Diana, detectives have also been trawling through Diana's phone and have traced a mysterious phone number. Could this be a 3rd suspect? And who is this David Ryan? And how is he connected to Diana?
So as part of the police investigation, the officers went to David Ryan's house in Hale in Greater Manchester. They asked him how he knew Diana. He said in 2010 he had met her at a dancing club in nearby Bowden. He said that he had not met her since, and that was the only occasion when he had seen her.
He gives an account that he knew the lady, not well, but he knew her. He met her about 2 years ago at a local dance club, and that was it really, nothing intimate, that he just knew her as a fleeting acquaintance, and that's all he gave to the police.
At this point, officers took a DNA swab of his mouth just to eliminate him from their inquiries.
Despite this latest lead, police still have no suspect. So detectives start looking deeper into Diana's digital footprint.
One of the things they looked at was her financial transactions, and it was noted there were large sums of money missing or that couldn't be traced.
And officers at Cheshire Police found a substantial amount of money that had been withdrawn by Diana, I think circa £60,000, whereby they had no idea where that money had gone. Straight away, that gave them the lead in terms of trying to find out who that money had gone to.
The large withdrawals ring alarm bells for detectives, and there is no sign of where or who the money was transferred to. But with the investigation intensifying, suddenly police make an announcement.
A 47-year-old man has been arrested in connection with the murder of a Cranage businesswoman.
As the inquiry progressed on the 2nd of September, the police announced to the media that they've arrested a suspect for the murder of Diane Lee.
The man who's arrested is David Ryan, the man who Diana met at the dancing club in Bowden first in 2010.
It was a bit of a shock to us all, really.
It had only been 24 hours since David told detectives he had met Diana once. So how had he ended up in police custody?
The day after Mr. Ryan had been spoken to by the police and given his DNA sample, he called the police and said that he had further information, that he did know the victim, that he'd met the victim the night before the murder, and he'd had consensual sex in her car with him. So Mr. Ryan said that he was in a relationship with this lady. He'd been for some time. He'd done work at the house. He had a conservatory window glazing company that he'd done a lot of work at the house.
But why would David change his alibi?
There are lots of reasons why somebody would keep a relationship secret. You know, one of the reasons is that that person is in a marriage. No, things need to be kept quiet.
Clearly his mind had been worrying about the DNA, that they'd taken the DNA sample and that he would be linked to the victims. So what he's done is he's tried to say that we would find his DNA once it had been examined, that he'd had sex with the day before, that he knew her and he had sex with her in the car. But it doesn't automatically say that he's murdered her, but his DNA would be found on her.
Detectives acknowledge David's concern that his DNA would most likely be picked up on Diana from the night before. But they still need to rule him out as a suspect.
So the police will be doing a lot of work around this new suspect whilst he's in custody, of his background. The background showed that he was a failed businessman. He spent lots of money. He liked spending money. He was buying stuff, exotic items for himself, for his family. And that shows the sort of mentality of the individual. And then that clearly links to the problems. Financially, he was bankrupt, business-wise.
They found he was in a huge amount of debt. His business, which was a window and door conservatory business, had collapsed in June 2012. It was quite clear that he was struggling for money.
David's money issues raised suspicion. On one hand, he was bankrupt. On the other, he was spending large amounts. And he'd been in a secret relationship with Diana, whose own bank accounts recently showed large amounts of money vanishing.
Throughout that, there was instances of spending which didn't tally with what he had.
So you're building the picture of someone who's will probably go to any means to try and support himself financially, not do the basics in life of working hard and getting money, but to get it quickly.
Intense investigations into both Diana and David's financial transactions ensue, and it isn't long before a link is made.
The next stage was finding out that David Ryan had been basically tricked Diana into investing tens of thousands of pounds of her own money into companies that just didn't exist. This has gone on for a period of time, and Diana had committed a large amount of money into these fake schemes.
Clearly, the victim was vulnerable in some respects, struck up a relationship with the offender. He would have thought probably she was a wealthy lady, she had money, he was in financial troubles, his business was going downhill, he owed money out, and she was probably a target for Mr. Ryan to take advantage of financially.
Forensic evidence is then uncovered, which appears to place David at the scene of the crime.
there was a footprint found at the scene of the murder in the victim's blood. So that would suggest and confirm that whoever was wearing that footwear was at the scene after the victim had been killed. And that footwear was the offender's footwear, Mr. Ryan, and the forensic evidence supported the fact that it was his footwear and couldn't have been no one else's.
And it appears David Ryan has been following the case closely.
Computer analysis of his computers at his house and his phone, and it was quite compelling evidence, circumstantially, that he'd been searching on Cheshire Police website about the murder, where the inquiry was up to.
Perhaps even aware time was running out.
Background checks by officers into Ryan's computer's history found that he'd searched for countries that had no extradition treaties with the UK.
Somalia was named, and a number of others. So clearly this is a man who wants to, or is thinking about leaving the country because he's done something wrong. This man is now trying a way out to disappear from the country, to get away from being arrested for this awful murder.
Police appear to have finally found their man. And by collating all their information on David, they pieced together a timeline of a murder.
Diana had obviously left the Man's End restaurant in King Street in Knutsford.
And they know that her car was caught by the ANPR cameras driving away from her home.
From there, she'd gone to Hale in Manchester to see David Ryan in her car. She picked him up. They travelled back down to Cranage, whereby they spent the night. And then, obviously, in the early hours of the morning, for whatever happened and whatever reasons, Diana was murdered.
Having killed the person he's been having an affair with for almost 2 years, David then sets a scene.
So following the murder, Mr. Ryan decided to cover his tracks, planting evidence in the lodger's room, using a dagger, leaving it there that he'd used to commit the crime. He'd also then started to plant various fires around the house.
He tried to burn the body to try and get rid of forensic evidence.
The problem being that he found that where he'd started those fires, there wasn't enough oxygen for the fires to let hold. The fires just burnt themselves out, so they didn't have the effect that he wanted to. His plan, quite clearly, was to destroy the whole property, to make sure nothing was left, to make sure no evidence was left behind, so nothing could be traced back to him.
This was all about him getting away with it. This is about him walking away and leaving whatever behind him. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't about passion. This was, how do I get out of this? And can you imagine using that amount of violence just to get out of something?
The police had sufficient evidence to go to the CPS to charge Mr. Ryan with murder.
But what really went on that fateful morning? And what may have driven David to murder Diana?
The trial of a man from the Altrincham area accused of killing a Cranage businesswoman has begun. Diana Lee, who was 54, was found dead after a fire at her home last August.
It's been 10 months since Diana Lee was found murdered in her home in Cranage. And 48-year-old David Ryan faces trial for her murder at Chester Crown Court.
Heading into the trial for this crime, I would clearly be concerned of all the evidence we've got. Have we got sufficient evidence to convict him beyond all reasonable doubt for a jury to believe the prosecution case and it's watertight? The last thing you want to do is go to a trial and there be some error or some process we haven't done. The continuity evidence has been missed somewhere and it be brought up at a Crown Court trial.
Local reporter James Wilson recalls seeing Diana's killer in the flesh.
On the first day of the trial, it was a bit of a surprise to myself to see Mr. Ryan stood there. He probably wasn't what you would describe as a person who probably capable of committing this crime, essentially. He wasn't very big, looked quite meek, and he was obviously incredibly nervous as the proceedings were about to begin.
The prosecution begins by setting out its case to the jury.
The prosecution outlined a really strong case in their opening statement. They detailed where the DNA had been found in the property, including the bedroom and other parts of the house. Quite a lot was backed up by phone records and evidence of the ANPR cameras around the area. It was an incredibly strong case, and probably quite surprising that Mr. Ryan at this point was still pleading not guilty.
The prosecution reveals to the court how David first responded to police.
I think police officers were quite taken aback by Ryan's reaction to the request for a DNA swab. He wasn't happy, he became quite agitated, and he suggested he didn't want to do it. It was only after persuasion by the officers involved that mouth swab was completed.
The prosecution reveals further evidence in relation to a text Diana sent.
The police searched details on her mobile phone records. They found out that text messages had been sent in the morning to her close friends, saying she'd been unwell.
A simple text message, but one which immediately flagged suspicion among investigators. The text was sent early on the morning of 9th of August, when Diana was already dead.
An expert gave evidence at the trial to say that was unlikely to be the victim's text message by the language used in the text message. So sometimes we will use different experts in certain fields, and this expert would say that it wasn't the normal language used by the victim, but more likely to be used by the offender.
A linguistics expert tells the court that the style of the text message did not match Diana's typical style, but it did match David Ryan's. Despite hearing evidence linking David Ryan to the murder, the court hears he has no previous convictions. So what would lead him to commit such an atrocious crime? But as the trial unfolds, more information comes to light, hinting at a potential motive.
Obviously, living in Hale, it's a very affluent suburb of Greater Manchester. Maybe from his point of view, there was a pressure to keep that up. Maybe there was a pressure to keep up that pretense that he just couldn't do anymore.
This man was in financial dire straits. Now, that is one of the triggers that can cause big problems in a relationship. He may have feared that his wife was going to leave him because of these enormous debts. He may have gone out and looked for someone like Diana to be able to get some money to fix the other situation. I think he targeted Diana for money, and the reason I think that is because he spent all the money on his wife. He spent all the money on IVF treatments, on holidays, on things for his other family. He did not get invested in his relationship with Diana. So, no, I don't think he was in love with her.
He'd already taken a substantial amount of money from Diana on the premise of investing in things that just didn't exist.
But as it transpired, the deeper he got in, that was actually becoming a bigger threat to the other situation than perhaps even the finances were in the beginning.
Somewhere along the line, this man is living a lie. He's married, he's got a child, he's been in another relationship with someone secretly, and unfortunately, all these things come to an end somewhere along the line. And in these circumstances, I would have thought in relation to the victim, she's gone to his house the night before the murder. She's collected him in her car, brought her back to her house.
Diana started asking questions about the investment. You know, the money that she'd given him, where was it? How was it doing? Was she going to get any back? She wasn't a rich woman. She couldn't just chuck this money away and think, oh, well, you win some, you lose some. And I think that he was under increasing pressure from her.
She was going to possibly tell someone, tell their wife, or go to the police to say, he's targeted me.
So was David trying to protect his wife from finding out about his affair and his conning Diana out of money?
And there's a stage where there's a trigger. He was more worried about his wife finding out and her maybe leaving him. He wants to protect the relationship with his wife, but we can't simplistically say that that is because he's so in love with his wife. It is far more likely that he gets his entire identity from the relationship he has with his wife. And if you took that away from him, you'd be taking everything.
After a grueling 7-week trial at Chester Crown Court, the jury returns its verdict. David Ryan is found guilty of Diana Lee's murder.
Conman David Ryan killed his wealthy lover after cheating her out of £60,000. Today, a jury in Chester found him guilty of murder.
He is sentenced to 34 years in prison.
There were shouts from the gallery from people connected to Diana who were obviously incredibly emotional at that time, hearing what they wanted to hear. Mr. Ryan was again pretty much motionless throughout this reading. There was no real reaction from him. I think probably he expected this verdict to come out, and again, he probably wasn't surprised deep down because he knew that he'd done this incredibly bad crime.
I think the most awful thing about this case is how dispensable Diana was to him. We all know she's a really, really lovely person. There's the lodger, who he doesn't know very well, but he's quite happy for both of those people to take the fall to protect his life. He has no empathy with their suffering or what's going to happen to them.
With David now behind bars, the local community look back and think why Diana, a successful and popular business owner, might have let a criminal into her life.
Diana didn't behave strangely when she gave the money to Ryan. She behaved in a way that any of us would have behaved in similar circumstances with the same information. She didn't hand over money to a person who she thought was dodgy or that she didn't like. She was taken in by him. She may have been lonely. She cared about him. She trusted him. We give money to people we trust. She wasn't a stupid woman. In hindsight, or from where we're sitting, we can say, I would never have done that. Well, I guarantee you, if you felt the way that she did, you might well have done.
It's just worrying, really, what can happen to you. And obviously happened to Diana, which is such a shame, because she was such a lovely lady.
Still in everybody's minds, still can't believe what's happened. It's just a tragedy.
For the residents of Cranage, she will never be forgotten.
We're Kent-bound as the experts fight an unseen enemy. Follow the action right from the beginning as new Cobra Cyber War starts. Thursday at 9.
Hampshire Fire and Rescue received a call.
The house was really ablaze.
Fire officers, when they went upstairs, they found a naked female. There was blood on the walls. She had some cable ties wrapped around her wrists as she had stab wound injuries to her neck.
I screamed and shouted and cried. I felt like half of me was gone.
I wouldn't have expected something like that to happen in this area. You just really feel for those children that have now got to grow up without a mother.
3 men arrived at her address, trying to break in, and had threatened to strangle and have sex with her.
We got told by CID that they had somebody that they thought murdered my sister.
On the south coast of Hampshire, on the Fareham Peninsula, lies Gosport. Once the base for the Navy supply chain, this picturesque town acts as a commuter hub for Portsmouth City across the harbour.
The Gosport, I'd say, is quite a quiet place to live. It's got a lovely coastline, and it's quite good for families. There's quite good connections to schools around the area. and you can quite easily get across to Portsmouth, to Gunwharf. Yeah, I'd say it's quite a nice, relaxed place to live for families and also the elderly.
Gosport really does have its own identity. The only way you can get there is either on ferry from Portsmouth or a couple of roads coming in and out of Gosport, so you very much feel like you're on the peninsula there, kind of isolated.
I think there is quite a different culture. It seems it's quite separate from Portsmouth because of the water.
We've got a really good leisure centre, lots of nice pubs, and there's always a park just literally round the corner. And you can get anywhere on a bicycle as well, because we've got fantastic cycle tracks here. We have a lot of people from all over the world really living here, and plus because it's naval, it just really has a lot of people here that are from all walks of life, really.
You have areas where the housing is very close in, rammed together, and you have others, bigger, larger houses with the more affluent.
In Gosport, especially with this road, you definitely could knock on any door and ask for help, definitely. And a lot of people have lived here all their lives.
Which is true of 27-year-old Kelly Ann Case, who was born and spent most of her life in Gosport.
When we was growing up, she was very bubbly. She loved to do dancing. She loved sports. She was very fun. We used to like doing like rollerblading when we was younger. We would do like all different activities, even if it was just walking to the beach and just acting like big children. Even though we was probably 15, 16, she would love it. We would argue and bicker, but it would never last very long. We would always make up within about half an hour.
But Kelly had to grow up quickly, after she fell pregnant in her teens.
Kelly was a very young mum, but she never pictured herself having children. But she told everybody it was the best thing she ever did.
But being a single mum didn't stop her from finding the time for love.
She was always lucky in love. Sometimes they didn't work out for many reasons, but she was always careful with who she loved and who she didn't love. She was actually on her own for a while because that's what she wanted. She wanted to be on her own, but in past relationships, she has been very lucky in love. She would always make people laugh, and she would always be like the highlight of the day, no matter how down you was or how low you was. She would always make you laugh.
Police, where's your emergency? I woke up and I opened the window, got the kids up, like you normally do, and then could smell a really strong smell of burning. It wasn't a normal smell of burning. I could see smoke coming out from the house.
The residents of a quiet street in the north of Gosport awoken to a house fire.
Hampshire Fire and Rescue received a call from a couple of builders that were in the area that saw smoke billowing from the address in Grange Crescent.
The house was really starting to go ablaze.
The builders were working in the area and they noticed some black smoke billowing from the address of Kelly's. And concerned that somebody may still be in there, they started banging on the windows trying to raise the alarm. There was no response, and Hampshire Fire and Rescue arrived at the scene fairly quickly.
There was probably 4 or 5 firemen in the back garden, which is very, very tiny. The glass was starting to smash. They were in and out of the house, obviously with the hoses going and trying to put the fire out.
Kelly's house is ablaze. And as neighbours watch, all thoughts turn to her children.
Because I'd seen the children going in and out every so often, and I was thinking, oh no, I hope they're not there. I hope nobody's there. That's what my worry was. I wanted to know if the kids were there because it was just a bit heartbreaking, really.
Fire crews break through the front door.
They found 2 areas that were alight in the ground floor of the address and then searched the rest of the premises.
The fire crews search the front bedrooms and find no one. But then they make their way into the back bedroom.
And it was inside there that the firefighters found the very shocking and grisly discovery of Kelly Ann Case's body in her bedroom.
Firefighters are suddenly confronted with a horrific scene. Kelly has been the victim of a brutal and sadistic attack.
Fire officers are used to going into dangerous situations and dealing with traumatic incidents, but when they went upstairs, they weren't expecting to find what they saw, which was a naked female tied up with multiple stab wounds and an obviously slashed neck. I mean, it was pretty traumatic.
What immediately happened then was the firefighters alerted the police whilst they tackled the fire that was still in the house.
And over the next 2-3 hours, more fire engines and police cars. The road was pretty much full. And everyone was talking about it on Facebook and on what's happening down there.
News spreads across the community and reaches Kelly's family.
I immediately rushed to Kelly's house and then spoke to the police officer and asked whether it was my sister's house. And they confirmed that it was. 2 CID officers come up to me and my mum. They both turned around and said that there is a body and it is deceased. I kind of screamed and shouted and cried.
Police believe there's no time to lose if they want to catch whoever was responsible for Kelly-Ann's killing.
Because of the way Kelly was found and the significant injuries that were so obvious, it was called as a murder investigation very, very quickly. And so we take control of the scene immediately. We try to identify who the victim is.
Detectives realised that the fire was set deliberately, potentially to destroy evidence.
We noticed there were 2 seats of fire initially. One was in the kitchen and one was in the living room, and it looked like bedding had been piled up and deliberately set alight. Upstairs in the back bedroom, Kelly was lying on the bed, naked. The bed was completely stripped. She had some cable ties wrapped around her wrists. She had some obvious stab wound injuries to her neck. Her face looked like it had taken some kind of physical assault as well. And there was blood on the walls and on the floors.
Police believe that the motive for the murder could have been sexual in nature.
I think when you find a female naked in bed like that, tied up with cable ties, the assumption one has to make is that this is possibly a sexual assault. The pathology is then carried out. Can we then confirm that?
The situation of Kelly's body and the manner in which she was attacked leads investigators to consider a terrifying possibility.
There's certainly a number of lines of inquiry and hypothesis that a senior investigating officer would form at the beginning of any homicide investigation, and one of those would be that this is a stranger attack. This is somebody who is not known to Kelly.
In the coastal town of Gosport, police are investigating the murder of 27-year-old mum of 3, Kelly-Ann Case. Her body has been found after her house was deliberately set ablaze.
Kelly was stripped, she was tied up, and she was tortured and then brutally stabbed with a knife.
Detectives believe that the sadistic and sexual nature of the murder suggests it could have been a stranger who killed her. And so they have to consider a terrifying prospect.
When we commenced our investigation, we contacted the National Crime Agency to see if there are any outstanding similar offences anywhere in the UK that we could liaise with those local police forces and share information with.
With the police having to consider this could be the work of a serial killer, at the scene a major incident is declared and the street has been secured.
We had tape going from the end of the road all the way across, down that end, and then they cordoned off all the way down the bottom, all the alleyways at the back. Yeah, it was just literally everywhere, tape everywhere. Even
All the little alleyways that go in between the houses had.
Yeah, because you've got a little alleyway there, and they were just cordoned off, didn't they? Yeah.
The news that a young woman has been brutally murdered stuns the close-knit community.
When we found out it was a murder, that was horrific. That sends alarm bells, you know, because you don't know who it is.
Covering Gosport, there's lots of low-level crime that goes on. There are lots of break-ins to houses and sheds and outbuildings. But deaths and murders are very few and far between and send shockwaves through the community when they happen.
It's just really sad that I wouldn't have expected something like that to happen in this area. And especially for a young woman who's kind of around our age, it definitely makes me feel quite uncomfortable. And you just really feel for those children, 3 children that have now got to grow up without a mother.
Whenever any murder happens, it has a huge impact on the community, particularly if the suspect is outstanding. So people are worried, who is it? Why have they done it? And will they strike again? So our job as the police is to try and reassure the community that, we are working hard to try and catch the killer and that we will do that as quickly as possible.
Suspecting that this could be a stranger attack, officers start house-to-house inquiries, and a neighbour steps forward.
During our inquiries, we came across a witness who did identify a male that he saw at about 5 to 7 on the morning of the 30th of July, who was just in the area of Grange Crescent.
A neighbour had reported seeing a sort of a scruffy, unshaven person near Kellyanne Case's home.
Described as looking a bit odd, surveying the premises, wearing a cap. And he said he's sort of driven up and down that road about that time for the last 10 years and never noticed anyone before. So this person definitely stood out for him and seemed suspicious.
Who was this man? And did he have anything to do with Kelly's death? But before detectives progress further, a check on Kelly's property uncovers a worrying development, which places their theory of a random stranger attack in doubt.
What was strange is that there was no sign of forced entry. The back door was unlocked, which would either suggest it's someone incredibly lucky trying doors, or somebody knew that Kelly was there and that the back door was unlocked.
Had Kelly known her killer? Or was it just pure chance that her door was unlocked so early on a weekday morning? The investigation shifts and focuses on Kelly's life circumstances.
In any homicide investigation, we would carry out a victimology, which is looking at the detail of the life of the victim, which includes, previous partners, potentially people having an affair, issues at work that we might uncover. So it's quite common for us to go through the victim's history with a fine-tooth comb.
As detectives question friends and family, they uncover that Kelly was going through a difficult period in her life.
Kelly struggled with a lot of different things in life. She was always open and honest with people, but when she did struggle, sometimes Kelly did drink.
She'd fallen on some difficult times. She'd recently had her children taken off of her by social services on a temporary basis. She had issues with alcohol and drugs, and I would describe her as vulnerable.
The investigation also uncovers elements about Kelly's lifestyle.
Kelly was well known. She had a wide circle of friends. Her neighbours weren't big fans of hers, if I'm honest. She would have regular visitors to the address, 3 or 4 parties a week.
She used to have parties with music and stuff.
I had seen quite a few people going in and out of the house, obviously just thinking they were just friends.
Often police would be called to access noise issues, antisocial behaviour issues, and she would probably hang around with the wrong people, I would suggest.
As officers investigate further, evidence shows that Kelly had been threatened just a few months previously.
Back in March 2019, Kelly had had some kind of party at her address, and there was an altercation there where the male ended up with a fractured jaw. And as a result of that, Kelly received some threats by family members of that man, and she had to flee the address for her own safety. So she left the area for some time and returned to Gosport a couple of months later.
I think she left for about 3-4 months, but she couldn't be without her family, so she decided to come back.
But with the threat still hanging over her, Kellyanne's neighbours noticed a change in her demeanour.
She kept herself to herself. She used to hang around out her front door having cigarettes, and you'd walk past her and she wasn't very chatty, but we didn't see a lot of her, to be honest.
No.
Heard a lot of her, but didn't see a lot of her.
Police believe Kellyanne was vulnerable and involved with some unsavoury characters. And after interviewing friends, key information points to a potential lead.
She had had this row the night before with one of her friends, so that was key that we identify who they were. We wanted to establish what the row was about and who was involved. So lines of inquiry were set in relation to identifying those individuals. But we also found out through her phone that she had been receiving threats. from 3 men who had arrived at her address, were trying to break in and had threatened to strangle and have sex with her. This was told to one of her friends. And obviously through house to house, we'd established that people had been at that address during the evening at various times. So again, it was really keen to try and identify those individuals quickly because they may have some vital information, or they may be the killer and they may have vital forensic evidence on them still.
Could any of these people have something to do with Kelly's death? But before detectives can follow the leads, they get an unexpected call. A 32-year-old man called Will Vallender comes forward.
My sister was actually seeing Will Vallender at the time.
We believe that one of Kelly's family contacted Will Vallender and they notified him of the death. It then quickly dawned on him that he was possibly one of the last people to see Kelly alive, having left her address at about 6:30 that morning. As soon as Vallender made contact with the police, the decision was taken to arrest him on suspicion of Kelly's murder and seize his phone and his clothing so that we could then forensically examine those. One might question, well, if he's rang the police, why would you arrest him? Surely he's got nothing to hide. But if you flip it the other way and think, well, actually, he's got things to hide and he's now trying to give a reasonable excuse as to why his DNA may be at Kelly's address or on Kelly, and he's getting his story in first before the police catch up with him.
But Vallender's connection to Kelly and his ultimate link to her murder is about to point the investigation in a completely new direction.
He was obviously jealous, and he decided it was his turn to go and see Kelly and have sex with her.
In Gosport, police are investigating the murder of mum of 3, Kellyanne Case, who was found stripped, bound and stabbed after her house was set on fire. The day before she died, Kellyanne told her friends that 3 men had turned up at her house, threatening to break in and rape her. Police also have a report of a suspicious man loitering outside her house in the early hours of the morning. But all attention has fallen on Will Vallender, who has been arrested on suspicion of Kellyanne's murder.
When I found out Kellyanne was murdered, I felt like half of me was gone. Some CID officers come to my mum's house and told my mum everything that happened and that it was murder. And then my mum sat and read a piece of paper to me and my siblings of what actually happened. We got told by CID that they had somebody that they thought murdered my sister. We didn't actually know who it was at the beginning.
Police have arrested Kellyanne's friend, Will Vallender, who came forward saying he had spent the night with her before she died.
When Will Vallender was in custody, he was interviewed by detectives, and actually he gave a very detailed account of what his movements were the night before Kelly's death. And he explained that he'd been drinking most of the day. I think around midnight time, he'd received a phone call from Kelly. She was quite upset. She said she'd had some people round earlier in the evening. She'd fallen out with one of them, and could he come round?
He was out in Gosport and he was with his friend, Brendan Rowan Davies.
So Brendan was a friend of Will Vallender. They would meet every now and then, and on that night, Kelly called. Will had been out all day drinking with Brendan, and Brendan decided to tag along. So they stopped off, bought some vodka, and then went off to Kelly's, where they consumed the vodka and also had some cocaine.
After drinking and taking cocaine, Vallender says he and Kellyanne went to bed, leaving his friend downstairs.
What Will Vallender then said was that him and Brendan Rowan Davies then left the home of Kelly at around about 6:30 in the morning.
Both Will Vallender and Brendan Rowan Davies left her home alone. They caught a taxi back to Vallender's house, and then Rowan Davies said he was going to go back to his home as well.
With Vallender claiming that Kellyanne was alive when he and Brendan left, police need to build up a full picture of what really happened that night. Key to this is interviewing his friend.
Officers were tasked to go and locate Brendan Rowan Davis, again, somebody who would have been the last person to have seen Kelly before she was found murdered. They went to his home address and there was no response.
With no sign of Brendan, Wallander tells the police that he'd spoken to his friend earlier that day.
Wallander had contacted Brendan Rowan Davis to tell him to contact the police as well. And the fact that Brendan Rowan Davis didn't makes that extremely suspicious in my view.
What had happened to Brendan? Was he afraid to speak to the police? While the investigation unfolds, the community is coming together to pay their respects.
People kept coming down the road, laying flowers, laying teddy bears, candles. Her sister was there quite a lot, and it was just really sad. I felt for the children more than anything.
When Kellyanne Case's death was formally announced by the police and she was identified, there was an outpouring of grief for this young mum, and that sort of materialised with a fundraising campaign to raise money, which ultimately raised about £1,300 for her funeral.
As the community mourns, the investigation is centring around the last two people who saw Kellyanne alive. And police have made a second arrest.
So within 24 hours, the police located Brendan Rowan Davis. He was with his brother over in Portsmouth. Police were dispatched and he was arrested on suspicion of Kelly's murder.
Rowan Davies' response to the police when they mentioned the murder or death of this woman was, I had an idea about that. Apart from that, he said very little. He was taken into custody. He was questioned and he just replied no comment to the questions that were asked.
With Brendan refusing to answer any questions, detectives turned to CCTV analysis to verify Wallander's account.
Because Wallander gave a detailed account of his movements with Brendan Rowan Davis on the way to Kelly's address and also leaving there. So we were able to establish, following the route that Wallander said he took with Brendan Rowan Davis, various CCTV points to identify the two of them together.
The footage shows Wallander and Rowan Davies taking a taxi from the end of Kellyanne's Road at 6:30 a.m. The taxi drops them off at Wallander's address 10 minutes later, where they're seen crossing the car park. 20 minutes later, Rowan Davies is seen heading towards his flat, arriving back at just before 7 a.m. Wallander's account of his movements seems to be true. But then, police analyse what Brendan did next.
Brendan Rowan Davis made his way back to his home address. We had cameras in that area that then picked him up about half an hour later, leaving his home address, but this time in a change of clothing, which is suspicious in itself.
Brendan is captured on the bus CCTV. But where is he going?
So having picked up the suspect on the bus, we know he got off just outside Cambridge Road, and so we're able to then scope the area for CCTV. Unfortunately, we came across CCTV in the kebab shop just behind me on the corner of Cambridge Road and Brockenhurst Road.
Brendan is seen walking back towards Kellyanne's house, just over an hour after leaving it.
The CCTV places him at the house for about 40 minutes.
Well, we believe that when Rowan Davis let himself into the address, he crept upstairs and Kelly was likely to be asleep. You know, it was the early hours of the morning. She'd been up all night partying. And he let himself in, and I think at that point he then held her at knife point and then tied her up and brutally beat her. And then some 40 minutes later, he's then picked up again on CCTV, heading back towards his home address.
But he doesn't head straight home. Instead, he walks to his mother's house, a short distance from where Kellyanne lives.
So we know that around 9 o'clock in the morning, Rowan Davis returned to his mum's address, where he then changed his clothes and then left that premises with a bag, and he was seen heading along this footpath. 2 hours later, a witness came forward who found some burning remains of clothes, which we then recovered.
Further CCTV evidence shows Brendan retracing his steps home.
We then find him at his home address on CCTV going to the bin shed area. But this time he's carrying 2 bags, one blue one and one white one, and he disposes of them.
Police immediately search his property and the bins.
What they find is a pair of knickers, which they believe to be Kelly's, and also some training shoes that have some blood on them.
Police also find items which match those found on the victim.
Kelly was bound up on the bed and she was tied up with some cable ties around her wrists. We found some further cable ties at the address that matched the same description of those found around Kelly's wrists.
Having uncovered both the means and the opportunity to commit the murder, the investigation turns to a potential motive and who this prime suspect is.
The connection between Rowan Davies and Kellyanne Case was mainly through Will Vallender. Rowan Davies appeared to be this sort of hanger-on, this kind of tagged-along friend. You know, the two knew each other or knew of each other, but I don't think they were ever close friends particularly.
He was a big man. He was 6'3", quite a strong man. We understand he had a low IQ, about 50 or 60, and he also had learning disabilities, including dyslexia. He was known to the police. He had about 6 previous convictions, but the most alarming one was a previous conviction for burglary of a house he broke into where the female was still on the premises. So a really concerning MO, I would suggest.
Detectives believe they have their killer, and when forensics return, it confirms their suspicions.
We then get the forensic results on the cable ties that were found around Kelly's wrists. And they have Kelly's DNA on them, obviously, but they also have Rowan Davies's DNA on them. So we went to the Crown Prosecution Service with all the evidence that we'd amassed against Rowan Davies, and they agreed to charge him with the murder of Kellyanne Case.
Will Vallender is released without charge, and a trial date is set for Rowan Davies. But when he gets his day in front of the jury, his account of what happened suddenly puts the case in question.
He said he was grabbed by a masked man who was armed with a knife, who threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he'd seen.
In Gosport, Hampshire, police have charged Brendan Rowan Davies with the brutal murder of mother of 3, Kellyanne Case. CCTV footage shows that after spending the night partying with Kellyanne and her friend, Rowan Davies returned to her house on the morning after. His DNA has been found on zip ties used to restrain her, and the blood found on his trainers is Kellyanne's. But he denies murder. Whilst police believe they have a solid case, they also have concerns as the trial approaches. As not only was an unknown man spotted loitering outside Kellyanne's house on the morning of the murder, but she had recently been threatened.
The fact that we had these issues, these unknowns of potentially people threatening Kelly in the past, death threats to Kelly, people falling out with her, that was the biggest concern, is that we needed to convince the jury that Brendan Rowan Davies was the person responsible.
The trial gets underway at Winchester Crown Court.
The atmosphere in court for the trial at the beginning was tense. Obviously, there were family members and friends of Kellyanne Case who were anxious to see justice be done.
I was at the trial the whole 4 weeks in Winchester. I was there with many family members, including my mum, who never ever missed a day. It was very tiring, but it was all worth it. It helped me to try and grieve for her, because I didn't want to grieve for her. I didn't want to believe it. And still to this day, I still feel sometimes that she's going to walk through my door, and she's not.
The pressure is on for Hampshire Constabulary, especially as Rowan Davies, who had remained silent during the investigation, has made some concerning claims to his defence.
Prior to the trial, the defence issue us with what's called a defence case statement. And what Brendan Rowan Davies was saying was that he did go to the address on that night with Will Vallender. He did leave with Will, but when he got home at 7 o'clock in the morning, he realised that he'd left his tobacco at the address, and so he went back to Kelly's to retrieve his tobacco. He said he found the back door left open, so when he went into the address, he went upstairs and he saw Kelly on the bed, naked, but she was unconscious. And then he was grabbed by a masked man who was armed with a knife, who threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he'd seen. He said he was so terrified he left the address and didn't tell anyone.
Could Rowan Davies be telling the truth? Was there an unknown masked assailant involved? But on examination, police believe there are major holes in his story.
He was cross-examined by the QC for the prosecution, and things just didn't stack up with his defence. The fact that he'd gone into the address and then suddenly this unknown masked attacker had grabbed him but not harmed him at all, so there was no injury to him, that didn't stack up. He then tried to explain why his DNA was going to be on Kelly and why Kelly's DNA was going to be on him by the fact that he was then pushed onto Kelly. The cable ties that Kelly had around her arms were the same ones found at his home address. He couldn't give an explanation for that. The change of clothes he had with him at the time that he went to Kelly's that he then changed into when he went to his mother's address, he couldn't give an account for that. That didn't make sense.
He claimed to have been absolutely scared and frightened by this mystery man, but CCTV footage from inside the bus that he took when he went home after killing Kellyanne Case showed that he wasn't petrified. He went to his mum's house afterwards and didn't say to her that he was scared at all. He said nothing to anyone until he had to suddenly defend himself in court.
By Rowan Davies' account, he left Kellyanne alive but unconscious with the masked assailant at 8:30 a.m. But just 3 minutes later, builders noticed smoke coming from Kelly's house.
The timings of Rowan Davies's account don't stack up.
In court, there was a lot of disbelief as to what Rowan Davies was actually saying.
Under cross-examination, Rowan Davies is asked how the masked assailant could have tortured Kellyanne, killed her and set fire to the house in the 3 minutes after he left.
His whole case was that within about a 3-minute window, this mystery man had murdered Kellyanne Case, and that Rowan Davies had walked off terrified, too scared to tell anyone about it. Rowan Davies' whole case seemed to be ludicrously implausible, just didn't seem to have been able to happen at all.
I thought Brendan's story was rubbish. This third person would not have allowed him to walk out of the house. You're not going to allow a person that have just witnessed you kill somebody, you're not going to allow them to walk. And in that space of grabbing his backy and then walking out of my sister's back door, not running, walking.
Whilst Rowan Davies' account is under scrutiny, the prosecution know they need to establish a motive for murder.
Brendan Rowan Davies clearly had some sort of sexual interest in her. It emerged at the trial that he'd said to her that he'd always fancied her.
But she just laughed that off and didn't take it seriously.
Kelly would never have a relationship with him, and Brendan didn't like that.
An analysis of Rowan Davies' phone also shows that he had followed the couple when they went to bed.
What Will Vallender and Kelly didn't know was that Brendan then, knowing that they were having sex in the room next door, got his phone out and started secretly videoing them having sex on his phone.
They said he was his arm put round the door kind of thing whilst he was filming that. He later deleted it, but this was a man who'd just been rebuffed by her with a laugh.
Will Vallender describes that he had left the house with Rowan Davies at 6:30 in the morning.
Will asked Brendan to make sure that the back door was locked, and Will would make sure that the front door was locked and post the keys back through. But we now know that Brendan didn't lock the back door, so he could gain entry when he come back.
CCTV then shows how Rowan Davies had made his way home, changed clothes, and returned to Kellyanne's house. The prosecution say he's armed with a knife and zip ties. He enters the house through the door he purposefully left unlocked.
It was quite clear that Rowan Davies had gone back there with a sinister intent.
When Rowan Davies let himself into the address, he crept upstairs and Kelly was likely to be asleep. And I think at that point, he then held her at knife point and then tied her up and brutally beat her. He was obviously jealous that Will Vallandern had sex with Kelly that night, and he decided it was his turn to go have sex with her. And she probably put up a fight, fought him off, and that's when he stabbed her.
In court, it's revealed that the knife wounds Kellyanne suffered were likely to be from an attempt to torture and control her.
When the pathologist gave evidence at the murder trial, he told how Kellyanne Case had suffered some horrific injuries, and he had to show sort of CGI reconstructions of these and stab wounds and slash wounds to her neck. She did also have broken ribs, broken bones in her body from what it emerged at trial may have been a panicking Rowan Davies who tried to sort of revive her.
We did get told in trial that she would have felt it and it would have been very painful. She had multiple stab wounds from her chest to near her hips, just basically prodding her with a knife. And he cut her throat 7 to 10 times. It has played on my mind a lot, but she would have bled out really fast and she wouldn't have felt it after a couple of minutes because her whole body would have just gone numb.
The prosecution say that Rowan Davies then stripped the bed and used the bedding to set the house on fire. He then walked to his mother's house, where he changed into clothes he brought with him, and later goes to a nearby alley to burn the ones he had worn to kill Kellyanne. But he does keep one item, a pair of women's underwear.
And one might think this is possibly a trophy that Rowan Davies has kept as a result of this horrific crime. He had taken them believing that they were Kelly's when in fact they belonged to a friend.
Rowan Davies is cross-examined for 4 days, and his account of Kellyanne on the night before she died is one of concern.
He was talking about things like how he was consoling Kellyanne Case because she wanted to, according to Rowan Davies, sort of kill herself that night because her children had been taken away from her.
It's then disclosed to the jury that Rowan Davies had been convicted of burglary 2 years previously.
He'd actually gone into a Gosport mum's house, kind of barged his way into the door, and the mum and children had to barricade themselves in a bedroom upstairs. But when the mum and her children came out, they found a butter knife that was on the stairs. When he was arrested for it, he was telling the police that he had heard someone was burgling the house, and that's why he'd acted and gone in, painting himself as a good Samaritan. And it was so shockingly similar to his defence case in the murder trial that it wasn't him, it was somebody else. I think that was a really chilling moment in the trial.
But the defence have one final seed of doubt to cast. The account of the 3 men whom Kelly had said were threatening to break in, rape and strangle her just a day before she died.
There is this fly in the ointment, was these 3 unknown people that had allegedly threatened Kelly 24 hours before that, threatened to break into her house and sexually assault her, and we never identified those individuals. I would suggest they probably didn't exist and were part of Kelly's paranoia at that time. As laughable as his defence case statement was, what was concerning for me is that there is a fly in the ointment there, for want of a better word. And all the defence need is to cast reasonable doubt around the account that the police say had happened, and then Brendan Rowan Davies walks.
After 3 weeks of hearing the evidence, the jury retires to consider the case.
The courtroom is an emotionally charged area at the best of times, and when you know the jury are coming back with a verdict, everyone is on tenterhooks, waiting for that verdict, and you hope as a police officer it's going to go your way, and you hope for the family it's going to go their way as well.
The jury returns to the courtroom after 4 hours of deliberating.
After 16 days at trial, the jury came back unanimously with guilty verdict of murder. And Rowan Davies was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment.
I was intently looking at Rowan Davies and I saw him just sort of shaking his head as the foreman read out the guilty verdict.
When we found out that he was sentenced 30 years without parole, my family and me was happy that we got the justice for my sister, but it was never going to bring her back. I personally think that he is vile, he's disgusting, and I hope to God I'll never see him again. I think he's a very, very sick individual that should never ever be released.
I believe if you take a life like that and you murder someone so horribly, I think you take a life, you should serve life.
Yeah, life should be life,
Life
not
should be life.
not 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is, or you can get out of good behaviour and stuff like that. Life should be life.
It doesn't seem like justice. She was young, she was only 27, and she would have had years and years with her children, so it doesn't seem just in what she's lost and what her children have lost in years and what he's getting for that, because he'll come out and he would be a middle-aged, late-aged man, and he can still do things with his life, and that's something that she'll never get the opportunity to do.
After 2 years, Kellyanne's family are slowly coming to terms with their loss.
Us as a family have lost a big part, especially my mum and her children. They've lost their mum, and my mum has lost her daughter. Kelly was always the happiest and the kindest and the caring out of all of us. And I would always like her to be remembered for the person she was and not for what he did to her.
And Killer in My Village continues with the story of a 29-year-old who met a brutal demise at the hands of her ex-husband. True crime every weeknight at 11 on Sky Mix.
In April, it seems people have the itch to try something new. Just like every year, as the end of April approaches, there's been an increase in climbers with brand new gear. At the lodge, while serving meals, I'm constantly on the lookout for anyone who might be overconfident in their shiny new equipment. Preventing accidents before they happen is also part of the job for those of us making a living off the mountain. My name's Jake Sullivan. I just turned 29 this year. If you ask me about my profession, I'd stumble a bit on the answer. Currently, I'm working as a mountain guide and part-time at the lodge. I stay in the US working these part-time jobs, and once I've saved up enough, I set out to conquer mountains overseas. Mountaineering is expensive, and things like permits can be a hassle, so I can't always jump right into it. It's especially tough for a broke climber like me. But a job with a goal in mind doesn't feel like a burden. This season, being able to live and entrust myself to the wilderness is my ideal environment. Today is the last Saturday of April, and many people are heading into a long weekend. The lodge is bustling. There are plenty of regulars. But there was one woman who clearly stood out. She seemed to have depleted quite a bit of energy to get here. Her pale complexion didn't strike me as that of a frequent mountain goer. She was panting and carefully settled herself down at a corner in front of the lodge, so as not to get in the way of others. She was constantly checking the heel of her left foot. She probably has a blister from her new hiking boots. I went inside the lodge for a moment, picked up a Band-Aid specially designed for blisters, and approached the woman. The sun hid behind my back, casting a shadow around her as she sat down. When I saw her lift her head in surprise, I was momentarily captivated. I mean, she was more beautiful than any other woman I had ever met. I'm not sure how to explain it, but she had a sort of translucent, fragile beauty. Her long, jet black hair was tied up with a hair tie, but it shone brilliantly. "Excuse me, aren't you getting a blister? Here, take this." As I offered her a plaster, she looked at me suspiciously. She seemed to be on guard, being approached by a big guy on top of a mountain. I explained that I was a mountain guide and also worked part-time at a mountain hut. With this, her tension eased a bit. "Thank you." In a small voice, she accepted the plaster. All the while, I couldn't help but look at her gear. It all seemed brand new, like this was her first time hiking. "How far are you planning to go?" I casually asked her as she took off her hiking boots and lowered her socks to check her heel. It was already past noon. If she aimed for the summit from here, she would end up walking back in the dark, which could be dangerous. Ideally, I wanted her to turn back here or aim for the summit tomorrow morning. Despite my hopes, she told me that she intended to reach the summit. Fog was starting to hang around the summit. Mountain weather can change quickly. Even if you aim for the summit now, it will be dark by the time you descend. There's fog coming in as well. Wouldn't it be better to give up for today and aim for the summit tomorrow morning after spending the night at the hut? On hearing my words, she frowned in discomfort. She seemed to dislike being instructed by others. But this was a matter of life, and I wasn't ready to back down just yet. If she got lost and the colleagues who went to rescue her got into trouble, I couldn't bear the thought. "I appreciate your concern, but I have my own plans. I find it uncomfortable to be directed by a stranger like you." Contrary to her delicate and seemingly quiet appearance, she clearly voiced her opinion. I was a little surprised by this unexpected gap. Casting a glance at me, she quickly started to pack her things. She seemed to want to leave here as soon as possible. "Hold on a minute, are you really going?" She ignored my hurried words. It looked like it was going to be difficult to stop her. I quickly called out to the boss of the mountain hut, explaining that a potentially dangerous guest was going up and I was going to accompany her. He quickly gave the go-ahead, so I grabbed my always-ready backpack and followed her. Soon, I could see her brand new backpack. Thinking she might dislike it if I got too close, I kept my distance while watching her clumsy hike. Just as I expected, her pace was slow. All the other hikers we passed were hurrying down the mountain. The fog near the peak thickened, and the scent of rain grew stronger. Unaware of the changing weather, she was persistently moving her feet. Even a dull guy like me could tell that she had some reason for climbing this mountain. I wish I could grant her desire. But this weather isn't good. I caught up with her at a run and called out, "We'll have rain soon, let's turn back." Caught on the shoulder by me, she turns back in surprise. Her face had turned completely pale. She must have been pushing herself too hard to get this far. It might even be difficult to turn back all at once from here. "You're persistent. Leave me alone." She tried to shake off my hand on her shoulder, but it seems like she didn't have the strength left for even that. The next moment, a streak of lightning flashes, followed by a thunderclap. Big droplets of rain started to fall immediately. "Do you have a raincoat?" She shakes her head in response to my question. I was a little annoyed at whatever sports store she had gotten her gear from. Not at her. I was annoyed at the salesperson who hadn't given her any rain gear. But this was no time to be annoyed. The rain was getting worse by the second. I hurriedly set up a small tent in a place off the path that looked safe. For now, get in. Just after I forced the somewhat resistant her into the tent, the rain turned into a downpour. I'm glad we made it in just in time. I was deeply relieved that we got in before we were soaked to the bone. The small tent was barely enough for 2 people. To prevent it from being blown away, I go outside once and secure it properly. When I come back into the tent, she silently offers me a towel. Thanks. I gratefully wipe my wet body with the towel. It smelled faintly of fabric softener. It was pouring. The raindrops seemed like they might pierce through the tent. I used a solid fuel to boil water and made cocoa. It was a storm outside, but the sweet aroma of the cocoa made me forget about it. The inside of the small tent felt like a different world. Here you go. As I offered her the prepared cocoa, she slightly nodded and accepted it. The cocoa warmed her from inside. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but her complexion seemed a bit better. Tomorrow morning, let's aim for the summit. There was no response from her to my words. The next morning, the rain ceased as if it had never been. We decided to head for the summit at dawn with the sunrise. She insisted that she could go alone, but I persuaded her and watched from a close but not too close distance. Maybe she was getting used to the mountain a bit. Her footsteps seemed lighter than yesterday. As her determination to reach the summit is such high, she'll surely smile once she reaches the top. I followed her, thinking such thoughts. Now here comes the unbelievable part. When we finally reached the summit, there was no smile on her face. She was just staring intently at the other mountains visible from the peak. I couldn't possibly think she had come mountain climbing because she liked mountains. She didn't even take pictures or express joy. She left the summit within less than 5 minutes. And just like that, she started descending as if fleeing. She didn't look back at me, and of course, didn't utter a single word of gratitude. I didn't help her because I wanted gratitude, but it still saddened me. In the end, I never even got to know her name. I've met an unbelievably rude woman. As soon as I got back to the cabin, I told my part-time colleagues about last night. I rarely get angry, but my colleagues found it funny and laughed at me holding their stomachs. I truly thought she was a rude woman. That was my first encounter with her. Mountains are inherently dangerous, and even the skilled people can